Heroes are unusual overgrown creatures that always compete with the Gentiles. One of them had to compete at a time of stronger. After a decisive firestroke, the hero in the helmet received a loud ovation and even greater love and envy of strangers. The characters of the hero flew the network. The girl at the table was surprised that the hero was able to overcome the enemy with one blow. But that is why he is called a hero. However, a friend began to suspect something. The longer he looked at the hero, the more he reminded their friend Kim-sun. At this point, the red-haired guy near consciousness and did not understand how he found himself here. He went hard to stand well on his feet, but suddenly he rolled the phone in the red-haired. Kim-sun wrote to get out immediately. Therefore, without causing suspicion, he went to the toilet, walking past people with a red-haired look at the news. As soon as he closed all the door and informed Kim-sun of arrival, he jumped through the window. Red-haired began to be nervous because Kim-sun could have horrible consequences. However, he assured that there would be no problems because of his beauty and removed her helmet. Red-haired was not to understand the admiration of the discovery of their appearance. So, Kim-sun asked Lee Ju not to frighten him and reincarnate. The blue glow swept by his body. His red eyes became crystal blue and the hair changed to carbon black. But for Kim-sun, he was disgusting and did not understand his superpower to change the appearance of others. But he was more concerned about whether he did not play the waiters. Before going Kim-sun, he ordered him to check the costume, and noted that they worked successfully. Lee Ju-won seemed that Kim-sun was pretending to be a hero. Having collected Lee Ji's clothes, he left the establishment unnoticed. He was sad because the ability to copy other people did not make him a real hero. 20 years ago, the first people with superstitions appeared in the world. However, they began to do chaos in the city and violently violated the laws. One of these law enforcement officers tried to neutralize with firearms. The blue-haired was so strong that he could hold the car with one hand. But the bullets reflected from the body of the blue-haired body, so he continued to go. In the end, the car fell on the rest of the surviving militiamen. Every day, the organs of the order died in the struggle for the peaceful life of ordinary people. Therefore, in order to restore justice, the government has issued a new law. According to him, each of those who violate him and pursue his or her own benefit is automatically recognized as a criminal, and everyone who stops them becomes a hero. The leader of the group of criminals, Nemesis, criticized the new law with the associates because police have always been at times weaker than criminals. Suddenly, a red mantle broke into a group of grouping and recalled the law. However, Nemesis laughed his strange suit. To show fearlessness and put a man in a mask in place, he turned into a combat image. The man in the mantle concentrated all the strength in his fist. As soon as Nemesis began to step on a man with a mantle, he rejected him so much that he pierced a huge hole in the wall and was crippled. Then the frightened Nemesis asked the stranger who he was. A man with mantia proudly called himself Justice, and since then Peace. However, Lee Ju-won could not save people like him. When he came home, he met a mess. In the end, Lee Jo acknowledged that not everyone was lucky to live in full. Lee Ju-won viewed the events in the calendar and was pleased to fulfill the freedom of action. Despite the illegality of Lee Ju-won, he could have provided himself with carefree old age. Suddenly, someone came to Lee Ju and he asked who came. However, in front of him, a chunky Justice was put on the threshold. He asked Lee Ju whether he really pretends to be other heroes in real life and asked him to work with a double. Lee Ju-won asked Justice why he was asking him for help. Instead, he ordered not to ask unnecessary questions and gave everything necessary. Lee Ju-won looked at all the papers. However, it lacked his real photo. Therefore, Justice took off the mask and told the business tomorrow. At this point, he reached out a black business card with the address. However, trying to stop Justice, he was late and remained himself. The next day, Lee Jin arrived in the specified high-rise building. He still had no idea why such a hero as Justice turned to him. So while Lee Jin was thinking about working for Justice for a longer time, and earning a room for him already appeared before him, he began to say that it was necessary to fill the document on non-disclosure of personality. However, coming closer, he saw Justice without signs of life. Lee Ju-won cautiously touched Justice and asked if everything was fine. But suddenly the sparks ran on the tips of the fingers and Lee Ju struck a current. He has never felt like that, and at some point the force rejected the body of Justice from his chair and Lee Ju-won fell to the floor. With horror, Laja looked at his hand and realized that she became like Justice. Therefore, in order not to cause even more problems, he ran away. Pushing strangers, he accidentally rolled Kim-sun coffee. He was puzzled that Lee Ju-won was present at the hotel. Noticing that he hid Kim-sun's hand, asked to show her. However, it turned out that she was in order again. Kim-sun was angry with a spoiled suit. Suddenly, a noise appeared, and Kim-sun wounded. Turning, they saw a criminal with 4 tentacles. At that time, Lee Jin was horrified that Kim Sun's wounds were not on the body of Justice. He was neutralized by someone else. The offender recognized Kim Sun and was surprised by his physique. However, Kim Sun was angry and reincarnated to fight. Kim Sun laughing at the offender's appearance, however, suddenly the tentacle became larger. So, Kim Sun, in law, the criminal managed to neutralize him. He enjoyed the victory and showed everyone present in Penthouse Kim Sun. Throwing him in front of all the offender brought panic on people. Lee Ju-won hid at the table. He understood that the heroes did not remain, and everyone hopes for the arrival of justice. The world needs a new savior. Suddenly, he noticed a girl in tears. Frightened by her life, Lee John ordered her to flee her so that she would not be killed, but the offender heard him first. The tentacles approached the girl. At this point, Lee Jan was reflexively rescuing her at the cost of his own life because he did not understand the cruelty of children. For a second, he doubted that he would have caught the tentacle. However, Lee Jono has suddenly transformed into justice for himself and managed to. Everyone was surprised by the emergence of justice. Lee Ju-won caught the right moment and was easily able to separate the limb thanks to new forces. The offender was squeezed with pain and looked at Lee Ju, and he said that he did not know what happens here, but under the first article the offender would be punished. Lee Ju-won felt an adverb of unprecedented power. However, the pink bubbles grew at the end of the tentacle, and eventually the limb grew again. She was already heading the pink tentacles, but to the surprise, she was moving too slowly, so he had time to think about the attack. In a moment, Lee Joni ran past the pink tentacles and reached the criminal and hit a surprised criminal in his face. Taking one of the limbs, Lee John, he pulled him to himself and spinned over himself. He shaked the criminal directly into the wall, leaving the dent in it. Lee Ju-won realized that he could do everything he wanted. However, he did not calculate that his strength would disappear without his own will. The offender came to him. However, he suddenly hit him. Lee Jan did not understand what happened and who helped him overcome the threat. And at the same moment, a girl with pink hair was full of energy and delight. She began to say that they both coped well and confessed that vanity from justice. She was curious whether he was specially distracted by the offender. But at that moment he was embroidered and was ready to attack. But the girl noticed suspicious activity and kissed the first. But Lee Ju-won has already disappeared. The girl was missing that she did not have time to take the autograph, but she approached her figure in black and reminded that it was necessary to take care of the wounded. A girl with pink hair ran to execute a new order, but a girl with lilac hair and a black mask suspected something. Lee Jonah, however, fleeing trying to be unnoticed at the scene. However, she paid attention to him. At home, Lee Jan was neutralized by all the papers that signed justice. There were so much of his hand. Throwing the remains, he wondered that Assassin was stronger if he disposed of justice. It seemed to him that it would be better for him to go before. Suddenly, her voice spoke to Lee JJ that would noticed his disappearance. He was frightened and did not understand anyone. Then the female voice said to look down. In a moment, the same girl with lilac hair and the mantle appeared. She noted that Lee Ju-won noisy as a hero. Then the black shadows took a bag of documents and restored the documents. So, the girl in the mantle was able to read all the contracts. Now she was convinced that Justice was killed, and that Lee Jo saw his body. However, she was in danger, so she wanted to neutralize Lee Ju. He was hit by black magical ribbons that came out of darkness. But Lee Jan understood that he did not want to give way and should be fought for a lifetime. Suddenly, he felt a familiar exhaustion, as in Penthouse. But he could not stop fighting, even if abilities have disappeared. So, Lee Jan continued to repel magical blows without complete reincarnation. Only the hand and part of the mask remained from the equipment. At this time, the girl in the mantle did not see a strong opponent in him and just laughing at him. Therefore, Lee JJ, she made her arrogance. He concentrated and pulled out a piece of asphalt. The improvised means could repel the attack if the forces were not enough and were not yet banned. When the piece broke to the pages of Lee Joni, he used a familiar technique and swung her in the face. The hood from her head slept, then swinging again so that she did not miss, but Lee Ju paralyzed again, so the girl took advantage of the moment to twist him with her shadows. The compression of Lee Jane lacked air, however she later thought and dropped it to the ground. Lee Ju-won was not why the girl in the mantle did not destroy him. However, she was worried whether he was going to take up the old one. The girl in the mantle offered the best option: become a double justice and keep peace in the world. The city still needed a hero. Justice was a symbol of all people fought, and the truth would cover the world. You need one who will replace justice for a certain time. He stood on the wild because only a couple of minutes ago, she wanted to destroy him. In addition, he did not know her. The girl in black introduced herself Chromium and proposed to check in the contract that she is in a team of justice. Everything really coincided. Chrome also offered 100 billion for the work of a double justice, and promised to cover Li Ju so that no one exposed his personality. If the world learns about the death of justice, criminals will rise all the time. Even the presence of justice has already guaranteed safety. She did not know or cope. However, the chromium began to wave that she may be in vain hope for his help and began to go away. However, Li Jian stopped the chromium sharply and insisted on 200 millions for a difficult thing. Chromium also noted that the main thing is not to regret the choice. Sunday later, Li Ji was mastered in a new role and was terribly tired. However, he was able to remember something. Chromium called him to move on the road, and later they were already traveling in the white Renault in class along the route. While the Chromium managed Sedana Li Zhen, Wan Ri read a printed biography. Suddenly, he asked the Chromium whether heroes have no heroes to know about fallen justice. She answered that they should know, but so it should never happen. They soon stopped at the Center for Storage and Transportation of Goods. Chrome explained that Li Ju won right when he noticed where they, however, only seems to be civil from the outside. She lifted the ID to the camera so that the red laser recognized Chrome, and the open door enveloped them with light. Inside is the headquarters of the heroes called Atrium. Due to transportation of goods, heroes could safely hide from threats. Chrome asked to stay Li JJ, she would wait at the door until she should join the heroes. The first of the superhuman team of Trium stated that in the patrol area of the second in the team of guards, the hot ones intensified criminals. The Trium was convinced that it was because of its poor management, because everything was fine in other areas. More threats have become several times less. However, Hesh blamed the Trium that other heroes did not cope with the responsibilities, because all the staff were transferred from its territories. However, the second of the superhuman team, Nivelle, believed that it was wise to invest in those who better cope with the tasks. While they argued that it was unreasonable to distribute the forces equally first in the team of the Arcadia Union, Li Ju-won realized that the discord prevailed among them. The first in the team of Condor Zeus noted that justice did not appear. The second of the same Pandora team specified that he was no longer Sunday. Then the naval was disrespectful that justice may have died, but the Hot ordered not to respond to justice in a bad tone. When he also burned that the special without justice, no other from the Union's team of Sanshi intervened, and applying his abilities of the recipient. Their behavior was childhood, however. She agreed with the suspicious disappearance of Justice and asked in the Chromium whether she knew something about it. Chromium replied that Justice would be absent for some time. However, Pandora from the forehead said her words are a solid lie. Since Justice was not for a long time, she decided to visit his number and saw the sea of traces of assassins' work. Chromium noted that no one should go to Justice without his permission, but Zeus has specified in or really Justice. Everyone looked at her from chairs and expected explanations and realized that her plan had failed. As soon as the Chromium wanted to confess, the door to the hall suddenly opened and they confidently traveled to Li Ji-won in the form of Justice. The Chromium was quite surprised by such a turn of events. Li Ju-won proclaimed what would explain everything that happened. He told that the heroes would be revealed if he did not do anything. So when everyone gathered together, he said that he would blame everyone. Before Li Jian, he entered the hall. He watched chaos among the main characters and realized that the media decorated reality. Li Ju-won understood why the Chromium wanted to hide the death of Justice, but when he heard Pandora, he tensed. She looked at the Chrome in a black bear until everyone understood what was happening and who to believe. He could not allow the heroes to learn the truth, and there was an even greater split, so made the decision to reincarnate and save Chromium. As soon as Li Jo went into Arcadia's hall, immediately woke up. He vividly remarked that Li Ju-won looks quite good. Chromium was worried that Li Ju-won would give herself. In the meantime, he tried not to show unnecessary emotions and surprise from the number of heroes. He was very worried that he could not be perfect. However, on the eve of Li Ju-won, he studied the behavior of Justice all night. Li Ju-won apologized for his long absence and picked up a characteristic posture for Justice leaning on the table. He copied everything to the little thing. Nivelle asked why he was late and what was the real cause of the absence. So, Li Jo suffered that he was attempted. Heshka asked why he had told her nothing, but Justice explained that it would be a danger and that only Chrome knew about the attempt. Suddenly, Li Jian was formidably clarified in Pandora. Whether she really dared to come to his room without permission, from which she was very scared. Li Ju-won dramatically bowed, because having told everyone the truth, he exacerbated the danger, and the criminals will be more careful in the following attempts. Pandora was even more swayed and begged for forgiveness, but Li Jian only expressed disappointment because of her uncertainty about his indomitability. The Triumph said that it was difficult for him to believe in attempted justice, and even in a crowded place. However, Pandora noticed that the lying is inherent in the triumph. However, she also spoke to Li Ju that he was too sensitive and had to end all the criminals in spite of the lives of peaceful people. Zeus supported Pandora as the number of fallen would not be compared to destroyed Gentiles. Li Jian was understood by the scale of the internal catastrophe. Suddenly, Arcadia intervened and noted that information about the attempt was important if he shared it. It is worth listening to it and finally starting the operation. After talking with Chromium with Li Jian, they went away in a black car. He was too tired after the gathering, so Chrome threw him a carbonated drink. She noted that they needed energy and that Li Ju-won coped with a dignity, although he did not do the agreements and did not expect the door. Still, Li Jian summed up that it was better to keep the death of justice. But he was also worried about what was happening with the main characters. Then the Chromium told about every coalition of heroes, everyone who took into account the lives of civilians and put them in the first place. Extrastist, for which is more important at any cost, to destroy the criminals, formed a Condor clan. They are also called bone collectors. Those who considered themselves chosen heroes called themselves a clan of superhumans, and the search for their own benefits are a coalition of the Union. Li Ju-won expressed the similarity of the heroes with politicians. They also form coalitions and are constantly arguing instead of resolving conflicts. Suddenly, he wondered in what coalition the Chromium was, and the Chromium that she was in the coalition of guards and has a high intelligence. Chromium also added that she was ready to argue for her commitment to justice. However, Li Ju-won expressed rather anxiety from her personality. He noted that when he declared an attempt on the life of justice, she tried to look surprised. However, her view was suspiciously evil. Li Ju-won said that during the practice of copying, he learned to recognize the smallest trifles in facial expressions, so he does not insist but knows what he says. Suddenly, the machine shook well, and the machine stopped. Li Jian-won was scared well, but the Chromium was absolutely calm and said that it could be obtained. She recalled Li Jian that with the advent of justice, criminals began to hide, so in order to completely destroy them, an operation was created. Chrome told that the operation is involved in the command of the Category clan. Li Ju-won guessed what she bows to him. Justice should appear in the midst of this chaos and join the battle because the operation of his help needed as ever. According to the plan, 4 clans had to take off the 4 flanks. The task of justice to arrive inside the first. Chromium was held by Li Jian. During the operation, it will allow it to be constant. Li Ju-won indignantly. Chromium promised that she would not allow his personality to be revealed. Therefore, he could have failed because he had never had experience in battle. Then the Chromium reminded that 200 million won just do not give his work. In addition, justice was the hero number 1. Therefore, if Li Jo-won abandons a win battle, it will be easily exposed over time. After these words, Li Jian agreed to the conditions and took the right to justice, but noted that his task should be paid separately. Running on the battlefield, he finally said that she should wait, and then see why Chrome should pay him. He had to put on the maximum in order to earn a sum of money and not to miss a single one. At this time, fierce fighting continued. Multicolored rays destroyed the Gentiles on each corner, so having arrived at Li Ji-vona, he noted the loss of criminals. While he thought he would not have something to do in this battle, a girl with pink hair on his back. She was glad that she met justice again. Li Jian-von remembered that she was in Penthouse during his first battle. A girl with pink hair began to outrage about trying to destroy it, because justice has no right to neutralize. Suddenly, in the middle of a conversation on Li JJ, she jumped a criminal with a spooky claw. However, he managed to notice the threat and put it on the ground with one blow. Li Ju-won used only a quarter of force so that he would not turn back from his lack, but this was enough to compete with others. The girl with pink hair was surprised to trimmed over the criminal lying on the ground. Li Ju-won asked how the girl's name is, and she called herself Maxri. Then he rushed to Maxri. Finally, what he needed to fight. He was faced with 2 criminals with a hammer and a sharp claw. They waited for the heroes to neutralize them. However, Li Ju-won reflected the attack by a powerful wave. Suddenly, another offender appeared on the other hand who wanted to burn Li Ju. However, Li Jian was navigated and created a barrier of asphalt, and then hit his fist into the barrier, sent a strong wave along with the debris of the rock on the criminal. However, all these events reminded him of his childhood. On that terrible day, he was attacked by criminals. She begged for help, but he couldn't help her, because he had no such power as it is now. Parents may be saved, and they would enjoy life together, but this was not destined to happen. But the Chromium interrupted him with the question of whether he was fine, and reminded that flying in the clouds of Li Ji, she would burn others. So he came to his senses. he ran further. Two other thieves waited from the pond for an unexpected attack. One was in the mask and the other in a turquoise suit. However, they did not have time to realize how Li Ju-wan rushed past them and raised a flurry of wind. The thief in the mask wanted to catch up with his partner. However, the thief in the hat refused because Li Ju-wan should already be in place. While he was thinking about whether it was necessary for someone to stop it forcibly, and a sharp golden spear stuck in the ground before Before Li Jan put a silky thief with a red mantle and a gold helmet. He moved directly to Li Ju. Chromium was surprised that Caesar is on the battlefield. Li Ju-wan did not understand who he was. Therefore, Chromium explained that he was the most popular among criminals. He gained his glory due to the disposal of numerous heroes only for the sake of fun. Therefore, Li Jan should not compete with him because of their uneven forces. Li Jan made the decision to flee past Caesar, but he noticed that Caesar was not in a hurry to catch up with him, and releases the golden rays in front of him. Suddenly, Caesar grabbed Li JJ by her neck and threw from all over the ground. Caesar triumphantly exclaimed that he lost if he started to flee immediately instead of fighting. At the same time, it turned out that Li Ju won, along with Caesar, is in a barrier called a conflict for two. The whole body of Li Ju was difficult, but he had no choice. He had to try and apply the forces that were still left. Li Ju-wan tried to apply a powerful blow. It was one of his crown tactics that could help overcome Caesar, but he was fast and stronger. Caesar formed a shield around him that pushed Li Ju. At the same time, Caesar immediately took his spear and plunged him in Li Ju. He laughed at Li Jan because he did not understand the fear of thieves before justice. Caesar could not look at how Li Ju-wan was stubbornly trying to pull a spear out of his body. Therefore, he pushed Li Ju's leg. Caesar had a sense of majesty. He ordered Li Ju-wagon to lay out in the fight against him to win. If Li Jin does not apply all his strength, then life will remain. But having exhausted them, he was at risk of transforming at a completely unsuccessful moment. Suddenly, Li Jan felt the influx of strength. Strength. He could not control his abilities so that such changes were caught by surprise. Caesar was also stunned that Legion dared to despise him and use only part of the forces. However, it was also profitable for him. Caesar was sure that by destroying justice, other heroes would stop resisting. Caesar aimed again to punch Li Jui with a spear. However, Li Jonah managed to stop the tools with his hands, thus destroying Caesar's confidence in his own power. Li Ju's body, she burned blue fire. He was overwhelmed and he was ready to fight further. Usually the abilities of the heroes resemble a filled glass. Sooner or later, using all the potential, the hero can exhaust strength. But in the case of justice, his strength was more reminiscent of the boundless ocean. So, Caesar was right, because Li Ju-wan used to drop forces. Therefore, Li Jan should not be worried about such little things as the exhaustion of abilities. Special sat in her office nervously. Then a girl in a suit with yellow hair and small horns approached her and asked why she worries. Sipa was not peeled that Justice had to give a signal for a long time. However, he did not communicate for a long time, and it was not like him. The girl with horns suggested that he may have met with Caesar, and therefore he was gone for a long time. However, in the opinion, even in this case, Justice would not have to stay for such a long time. So, she made the decision to come to the place and find out what was happening. Justice may be in danger. At this time, a fierce battle lasted between Caesar and Li Ju. During him, Caesar received a dent on his helmet. He didn't understand what was happening. Earlier, Li Jain was a light target that could be overcome. However, he was completely different now. Li Ju was overwhelmed by the strength, and his skill on the battlefield did not know the limits. In fact, he decided to put his strength on his own. When he restrained, his forces weakened quickly. However, he could now transform completely. Caesar attacked her with a spear. However, instead, Li Ju so much struck him in his stomach that Caesar had fallen out of pain. Caesar did not want to recognize his own weakness. Then he was overwhelmed with anger, and he formed a double dome to weaken Li Ju. He really worked. Li Ju-wan became slower in the movements, so Caesar again overwhelmed the hope of victory. He threw the spear with the whole force into the body of Li Ju to neutralize him. He flew too quickly, so the chances of survival were very little. However, Li Jan did not interfere with the second dome. Therefore, he turned and instinctively hit his fist on the sharp end of the tool. From a powerful blow, the spear flew into piles. But after Caesar realized that his tools were completely destroyed by the wave had already grown. From her strength, the dome collapsed and Caesar with a mutilated mantle flew a couple of meters. His helmet was destroyed as well as a spear. So, now his surprised face with round eyes and small pupils was clearly visible. Li Ju-wan did not expect such potential. Instead of evading the attack at the last moment, he managed to go out. Suddenly, the silence cut a terrible sound. When the dome disappeared, then Legion noticed that part of the house began to fall. Having seen in more detail, he noticed the heroes from the Condor clan who competed with the criminals, so they did not pay attention to people's lives. Suddenly, Li Jian saw that from the ray of one of the members of the clan, another building was damaged and began to fall on it. However, he also understood that Caesar lies just where the house would fall. Li Juwan could not leave him to rest under the wreckage. But on the other hand, the offender does not deserve salvation and was destined to die. But at the last moment, Li Jian still changed his mind, and yet he did not have time to escape. Another multi-story man fell on him, so Li Juwan watched everything helplessly. They were almost pressed, but fortunately the chromium restrained the word and came to the rescue. Still, she was not delighted with that Li Jian saved the offender. But Li Zhou's denied her and stated that he could not throw Caesar. In addition, in his opinion, he would have made true justice. Suddenly, Caesar recovered and opened his yellow angry eyes. He was not going to give up justice so quickly. He escaped from the hands of Li JJ and put a knife to her throat. Chromium. Caesar could not allow someone to fibers his body and his arms in an incomprehensible place. At the same time, Chromium spoke to Li JJ as a result of the situation. Criminals cannot be rescued under any circumstances. She noted that Li Jonah did irresponsibly rescuing Caesar. So, if she perish, he must do everything so that Caesar does not run away. At this time, Caesar did not understand what they were talking about and why they were not embarrassed by Chromium's threat. So, he decided to remind them of it. But Li Jian denied Caesar, so he finally felt pleased to attract attention, and Li Juwan understands all the seriousness of the situation. But unexpectedly, he grabbed Caesar and with the breeze pushed him against the wall of the building, leaving a crack in it. Li Joni said to Caesar that he should now remove all the mess after him. She laughed at the chromium and noted that she had at least a hanging tongue in Li. She reminded that it was necessary to submit a signal of arrival at the place, and from her words, Li Jian, he span. He forgot about it. Turning on the right, he reported a team of heroes that he had already arrived in the center. After that, Li Jian jokingly said 200 million and are really difficult. The chromium was surprised by the power of Li Ju. Caesar was a strong rival, but during her first battle with Li Jian, he was too weak. Maybe he learns quite quickly. Meanwhile, Li Jian checked whether Caesar was breathing, but he looks like he left the world of living. Looking at all this, chromium thought that he was not the greedy man of money. Therefore, it can be more expected from Li. They were scrutinized by the hot. She gave the radio that sees justice with her own eyes, though it had to clear the territory. It was good that Li Ju-1 could have been transformed for a long time, but the use of abilities is greatly tired, so now he didn't feel his feet. It was necessary to find another way to use the ability to premature from feet. But the chromium happily clarified that Li Ju was able to awaken the original forces of justice. Her eyes shone, and the smile stretched to her ears. She is too interested and passionately embarrassed by Li Ju. He did not understand why she was looking at him with a sweet expression. The chromium wondered whether he did what they agreed, so he managed to distract and switch to another topic. On the battlefield, Li Jian tried to touch the fallen criminal. It was necessary to find out whether you could really get the abilities of the destroyed. His hand also emitted sparks as on the day he touched justice. The feelings were the same as on that ill-fated day. But this time Li Ju-1 was unable to absorb strength. Something blocked and discarded it. Then the chromium suggested that it may only absorb only one force, or, in justice, it is too powerful to leave another place. All these theories made sense, but at that time it was difficult to draw accurate conclusions. Still, Chromium noted that Li Ji-1 deserved on vacation. When he asked if it was a party, she answered the door to the hall. When the door opened, then Li Ju again enveloped the golden glow. The good thing she saw him surprised him. Chromium said that the victory of Li Ju was also the victory of all the heroes from the Grand Clan. They all celebrated the victorious battle by drinking drink. They were even more pleased to see Justice at the threshold of the banquet hall. They all surprised how Justice was able to be the first in the center during the battle. One of the heroes with a mug in her hands jokingly asked at Li Ju what she would remain to do to other heroes if he destroyed the justice. Li Ju-1 was aware that even heroes were very fond of justice and rejoice in his victory as his own. So, when Li Jian stretched out a mug with a drink, he won the glass triumphantly and drank it. However, the Nivel and the Triumph thought something. They discussed the inadvertence of guests, a Nivels, called the fun for children. When asked Nivel Triumph, he answered that he would rub his smiles out of their face. The Triumph was not sure whether his plan could be called plan, however, the smiles of the heroes would soon have to disappear from his face. In the morning, Lee Jae-in was in a bad state of hangover. He was surprised by the amount of alcohol that could fit in the characters in one evening. When he left the bedroom, he considered the room with surprise to live. He did not believe that he would live here at this time. Lee Ju-won checked the account in the phone. Fortunately, the chromium kept the words, and a huge sum of it came to his wallet. So, now he, with a broad smile on his face, realized that he has the right to call himself successful. However, looking at the chair, he could not leave memories of the body of Justice in it. The reason for his death was still winged in the air and did not rest. So, Lee Jae-in undertook to read the forensic examination of the death of Justice and found out that there were no fatal wounds in addition to the forces. Suddenly, someone entered the room. Lee Ju-won immediately suggested that it was chromium. She just needed him to consider medical conclusion. Lee Ju-won exclaimed that he just began to view the forensic examination of the forensic examination. However, he did not hear any answer. Instead of chromium, he saw that his housing came in a hot. Lee Ju-won was frightened because she had no idea why she came without warning and hid behind the chair. Hesh was looking for Justice as she heard his voice and knew that he was here. But when she came to the chair, she did not understand what he was doing there. Then Lee Ju-won replied that he was only warming up. Prior to her arrival, he had time to reincarnate into Justice and began to squeeze. The hot has expressed a delight because she had no doubt that true Justice could perform exercises at home even the next day after the party. Lee Ju-won asked why Hesh came to him by surprise. She announced that he had to talk to someone because of a pile of attempts. Then Lee Jo realized her gaze in the negotiation hall. Most likely, the hot was evil precisely because of constant attempts to attempt his life. Suddenly, she came to Lee Jae and hugged him firmly. It surprised him because he did not expect a sharp softness from the hot. She looked with a mournful expression and said that he brutally committed when she did not tell her. Lee Ju-won was frightened by such closeness. He did not understand what was happening and why he should tell her everything. From surprise, he asked her by name. The hot did not look out from him. She reminded him of whether they had agreed to call him named Manhwa. From such a turn of the events of Lee Ju's face, she twisted. He did not want to believe that he understood. Similar Justice with Hot had a relationship. Hesh was still hugging Lee Jae. He did not know what to do in such a situation. Everything indicated that the Hot was met with justice. However, remembering the biography of Justice, Lee Jae did not mention that the Hot was stated as his girlfriend. It was not clear whether to call it by name. However, the flow of Lee Ju's thoughts interrupted the need for a hot one. For a long time, he had planned to stand silently. In the end, Lee Jo asked the hot that he did not call her Janhwa. He justified that he was not accustomed to calling her Janhwa because he was calling the hot heat in people. She looked carefully at Lee Ji and said that everything was okay, despite the fact that he called her heroic name. But at the same time, she carefully got her sword from the belt, and in a moment, the hot faded on her. His shoulder was cut. She almost believed that Lee Jae-in was true justice. Her wicked were no limits. So, the hot asked whether it would be Lee Jui to separate her at least one of his hands. The brutal battle between Special and Jujana began. Hesh was the deputy chairman of the clan of Guard, and her ability was lightning speed, and, in addition, she skillfully possessed a dagger. She again swept to Lee Jae in order to reality said, however, Lee Ju stopped her sword with her own abilities. Hesh noted that Lee Ju's abilities and strategy, she was very similar to that of Justice. However, he spends his forces irrational. Then Lee Ju replied that because of his tactics, despite his wound, he has at least his hands. In the efforts to give the special Lee Ju Jan, he looked in her direction, but she disappeared from the place, and he kissed the floor directly. Now, Koshi understood how he defeated Caesar. He was enough to use gross power. However, it is visible that Lee Ju still cannot control ability. Hesh said that if she wanted to destroy him for a long time, so she suggested that he stand quietly because he would not be so painful to get wounded. But Lee Jo asked her whether she really was standing if she wanted to cripple. Then the hot flew to Lee Jae and enclosed the dagger directly into his chest. The red stream from the wound dropped to the floor. However, although Lee Jan did not have time to stop the dagger, but at least grabbed her hand. So, he disappeared with his fist in the head of the special. From the surprise and the power of the blow, she turned the face from Lee Ju. Lee Jae-in did not know whether he was able to kiss her at all, and did not really miss. However, the eyes of the hot fierce and the skin appeared to red vessels. She was extremely angry and asked how he dared to pretend to be Justice. When Lee Jae-in swung it again, she had already slipped out of his hands, but the hot was angry, so it allowed him to use all the potential. Suddenly, the breeze and Lee Jo felt her crown tactics of thousands of cuts. Her powerful cutting left signs throughout his body. Then the hot was aiming again on Lee Jae. He realized that she was really ready to separate his hand, and her sharp blade already pierces the skin. However, Black shadows wrapped her tools, stopping the attack. The chromium was timely and said to the hot that it is a hard time when the language concerns justice. So, realizing that Chromium knows about Li Ju's activities, she had a hot one demanded that the imposter pretends to be justice in the eyes of everyone. The Chromium confessed that in fact, justice was killed, so the hot man was aware that Li Ju was in fact pretending to be it all this time. Already translated and with pals at the scene of the cuts, Li John sat on the bed and explained that he had to replace Justice by accident. Chrome explained that Justice had to be replaced immediately, but the hot was raging since Li Ju-wan did not have enough skills. He would be exposed very quickly, and she panicked in the Chromium, or understands that she is in general that they were doing with Li Jan. Chromium with Li Jan was calmly explained that the substitution of Justice would win a little time to find out who deprived the life of Justice. But the hot was worried that Assassin would still come through her. However, he denied the truth, only Hot and Chromium. In order to clarify everything JJ, it explained that when massive destruction took place, no reaction has occurred. Hesh asked or not means that, regardless of who Assassin, he would sooner or later come to the conclusion that his crime was abandoned. Li Ju-won denied her words, so she immediately went to the exit. The Chromium wondered where she was going, but the hot said that she needed to ventilate. Li Ju-won shrugged from the thought that he is most likely to hate him now, but Chromium replied that it is better not to pay attention to it. No one but the hot worked so much for justice, so she really needs to calm down and put thoughts. Now, only she was a link with the clan of the Doroi. Previously, the order was followed by Justice. However, heroes can now run away by leaving a hast alone. Chromium switched to emotions. It was drained by the fact that the characters were not true of their title, and they must constantly manage. Until the death of Justice, the heroes will remain in positions. And in people, the hope will be glowing. Now Li Ju-won understood the root cause of Chromium's plan. He decided to reassure her, reminiscent of Chromium, how skillfully he pretended to be Justice and that he skillfully possesses oratorical abilities. But suddenly their dialogue interrupted Chrome. After reading the details of the Chromium, she asked if Li Ju was ready for a new task. In a moment they were already sitting in a cafeteria eating an order. Li Ju-won was a little embarrassed to sit in the image and quietly imitate the meal. Asked what he had to do, she answered that after a statement of attempted lifetime, La Javona, it was necessary to appear that everything was fine with him. But Li Ju was interested in whether he had to pretend to be meant. The Chromium said that he needed to get used to, but would be less. Such measures were needed because on this day the event was planned among the heroes. Li Ju-won asked what Chromium was referring to. Then she pointed to the crowd. They were new heroes who went on the biggest event in Atrium. The newcomers had to decide which clan they would fall. It was like an open day at the university, but larger. Li Ju-won said it should be a very important event. Then he asked what he should do, and whether he had to compete with criminals. Chromium got up with a tray and empty utensils and replied that she would explain everything on the way to his destination. Coming to the place in front of them opened a huge stadium. Li Ju did not restrain him, so the Chromium shook his elbow so that he would not give his fright. Li Jan was surprised by the number of heroes, but still asked the Chromium for his duties. She looked at him angrily and replied that there was really nothing. Li Ju-won was still embarrassed. Chrome explained that even the number one hero should not interfere in the West. A should simply sit and observe. After they examined the stands, it turned out that the superhuman and the union of the most scored places. At the same time, people were significantly thinner in the clunks. Chromium noted that many young heroes want to use their strength, so it is obvious that the Union clan gained very popularity. Suddenly, they joined the hot. Li Ju-won, without believing her own eyes, asked if she really came to look at here. She roughly replied that she really came to see, however, it does not mean that she supports their plan. Li Jiao suggested that she was to blame for him. The competition was announced. The hero with pink hair belonged to Superhuman. The other in the green trousers was in the guard. The battle began on the signal. The hero from the clan of the Witter came up with a hero from the Superhuman, but he had to go back and pass the attack. Then the hero of the Superhuman used his power that pushed him for a couple of meters, and the hero from the guard noted that he was quite fast. After that, he immediately attacked the hero from the guard and began to keep his hand. From such power, she blushed well. Li Ju-won asked in the Chromium why they started fighting immediately. She answered that it was only a PR in the public to get more attention. Then Li Jan was asked if it was not friendly competition, but it was difficult for her to call it. At this point, the hero from the clan shouted at the pain. His hand was still red, but she ached and her veins acted out. From the horror of Li Ji-won got out of place, but Chrome reminded that he should not do anything because it was cruel battle for power. Therefore, all actions at the stadium take place according to the rules. In addition, Justice can still not interfere with the battles of the heroes. At the same time, the hero of the superhuman laughing at the hero of the guard. He asked why the hero from the guard would not stop the fighting, though his hand was still trapped. Unable to withstand the mockery of Li Jian, he approached the hero of the superhuman and grabbed his hand, already coming to make a fatal blow. There were no limits to the surprise of the hot and shame. The hot burst into surprise and the chromium closed her face with her hand. Li Juwan remembered how his sister was once fond of atrium. She was very pleased that he would go there in the near future. He annoyed his sister for a sweet face in a good way and fantasized that if she wanted to go to atrium and take him, then he can take it with him. The joy of the sister was easy to read, and they swollen on the little ones that they would get there. The sister believed that the heroes were bravely struggling with criminals, and thanks to their courage to protect people, can live safely. Li Jian-1 noted that the heroes were the only support of people, but the hero of the superhuman continued to mock and laughed by making torture another hero. However, the superhuman hero was not ashamed. He proclaimed that what right he should interfere with fighting, and that the heroes of the heroes became a slack in the clan. Then he suddenly asked Li Ju what he would do justice if he refuses to let go of the hero from the guard. Then the hero of the superhuman reminded his ability to control gravity and take force. So, holding his hand was a bad idea. However, Li Jian was stronger and was able to take and squeeze the hero's hand of the superhuman. From pain, he jumped unpleasant grimace. Li Ju-1 recalled that it was possible to lift his right hand to surrender. So, the question remained why he didn't. The hero of the superhuman clan was written from the painful squeezing of his hand, while Li Jian asked him, however, to help from the same clan from the stand came out. Dryon said that if Li Jian-1 wants to participate in the battle, let him stand against him. Suddenly, the red beam swept the stadium and damaged his hand. Dryon noted that in order to compete with someone, might have to choose the opponent of his level. People from the stands were enthusiastically watching the battle. The chromium noticed that the hot was worried about Li JJ. Hesh realized that he did not control his strength yet, and given his past battles, he has no chance. Li Ju-1 suggested to stop the duel, however, the Drayor refused. He was not one of those who throws the battle. Therefore, a full battle began. Li Jonah concentrated all his strength to send to the driver, but he was able to predict the attack and grab the fist of Li Ju. At the same time, he rejected him and used his abilities. From the attack, Li Jian felt weak in the body and realized that his forces began to disappear. The audience was surprised with the driver. Justus lost his shape and no one understood why he was a pair for battle on the battlefield. Super ranking was that every attack was absorbed by him and applied the enemy at times stronger Euron. All of the stands began to suspect something. Then Li Jian-Van understood the super doctor It, and to guide instincts was a bad idea for him. So, Li Zhou came up with a plan. He would have to send such a powerful blow so that the duck could not absorb it. The confrontation of Li Ju and Dryon was too strong that the wind came to the stands from their confrontation. Chromium only asked for how long it would take. Suddenly, something stopped by Li JJ with a driver, and their bodies waited. As Arcadia turned out to go to the stadium because he understood that they did not think about other people. Arcadia pointed to the lack of empathy, and Dryon left the battlefield. Suddenly, she came out of a hero from a guard who would have to compete with the hero of the superhuman. He thanked Li Juvona, who stood up for him in the battle, and after him approached, and others who praised Li Ju for his courage. When Li Jian won, along with Chromium and Hot, were in Penthouse, they received a letter with the results of the last year's competition. According to the calculations in the document, the trick of Li Ju has significantly raised the Guard clan in the rating. However, the superhumans still lead. Li Ju was surprised by such a contrast distribution of votes. However, the Hot tried to explain everything. Despite the loss of the hero on the battlefield, and at that time the criminals became many times less heroes, still not sure that they would like to join the clan. Li Ju-1 still did not understand the problem of the results of the chromium, reminded that in power, superhumans were not the best heroes who were not confined to guard. The only way out in this situation was the creation of a new alliance. However, the most suitable was the Union clan, and it requires their initiative with it. So, she had an idea in Li JJ. It would be difficult to translate into 2 heroes at a time, however, it is possible. Special Chrome was shocked. However, Li Ju-1 asked for the plan and the appropriate salary, taking into account how much every stage of his plan would cost. Chromium with Li Yana arrived in place, and she explained that Wilhelm III in the rating of the Union. Their rating is determined by the popularity of heroes. Although it is difficult to call it really strong, however, due to a large number of parties, it is significant and important in voting. Li Ju-1 needed to falsify the results of this vote. So, noticing from the roof a girl with red hair, he had an idea. At this time, Wilhelm announced on the roof of the high-rise building that it was time to get away from protecting people and finally should be taken away at a party. After the departure, the servant suggested to stop drinking, but Wilhelm translated the topic that he would be better able to follow his outfit. A sudden girl with red hair poured Wilhelm cocktail. He has already begun to be indignant, however, after a spicy offer. His mood improved. So, together they went to Wilhelm's number, leaving the servant himself. Unbloating the door, they got into the luxury number. As soon as Wilhelm asked about the fun, the girl transformed and hit him with the hand of justice. Li Du Von found a tablet from which the vote should be held. He defended himself with a retinal scanner and a print, but it was not a problem for him. Arcadia was surprised that Wilhelm, despite the party, joined the vote and repeated that his essence was to choose the Union clan. So, before the vote of Arcadia posted the heroes on the list, Li Ju-wan was disappointed because the voice for the clan was chosen from the hero's reputation. After the vote, Arcadia was surprised by the unexpected result. However, their mission was fulfilled and the conference was completed. When Li Jan came out of the building, he was already waiting for Chrome. She wondered how everything went, and he proudly stated that he had coped and earned 2 billion. Awakening after the loss of consciousness, Wilhelm acknowledged that it was not necessary to drink much. However, he most likely spent a great time with the girl. Wilhelm also had time to vote because his mark was already on the tablet, but he wanted to find a girl, and the servant could help with it. Li Jan sought to get into the role of justice more perfectly, so, returning to his apartment, decided to take the necessary equipment with him. Heist was also walking with a dissatisfied face, so he was already used to her mood and worked on. While inspecting his belongings, Li Jan accidentally found a family photo. His mom would be delighted if she saw his reincarnation into justice. Suddenly, the frame cracked and the photo fell out of it. In a moment, she found herself under the bed, so Li Ji-won sought to get it from there. He leaned to take the picture. He wanted to lift the bed with the other hand. However, instead, it got into the air and made a dent in the ceiling. He spoke about chromium, and she asked her only today there are such changes. Then he took the handle and easily crushed it with 2 fingers. She then explained that with the frequent use of his strength, the ability could affect his normal state, and this is especially evident in beginners. Having completed the discussion of Li Ju, Bon reincarnated into justice and joined the conference. Arcadia asked for a communication format because of his departure. The naval from the superhuman team was driven by Arcadia to announce the results. However, unexpectedly for all, he announced that the vote stopped on the guard. This meant that the next step would be the extermination of the rest of the criminals. However, he was raging and disagreeing with the results. Zeus at this time dealt with the bodies of criminals. However, the indignation of Neville forced him to intervene and to ask why he is so against the destruction of the Gentiles. Then he explained that it was a senseless waste of time. However, Li Zhao's denied because the last battle did not give anything and had to be struck. Sanshi from the Union clan agreed, and Pandora asked why Nobelius did not seek to destroy criminals. Trium summed up that all honestly and without criminals would come peace. Li Ju did not understand how everything came to absurd disputes. The chromium looked at the sealing machine and was stunned by the dent on the ceiling. So, after the conference, she asked how Li Ji would explain all the owners. Instead, he replied that he would give a pack of money because it would not be the first time. Then Li Jan dared to ask why the chromium worried for him, though they have only selfish connections. She then explained that missions are quite dangerous. The tasks threaten the life of Li JJ Shi, and that's all. However, there was also a personal reason that she did not dare to explain and interrupted the conversation half a word. When the chromium ran behind the door, hiding under the hood of Li Ji-wan did not understand what he did wrong, so he decided not to touch this topic for a while. Suddenly, a servant of Wilhelm appeared at the doorstep. He recognized the chromium. However, she asked that Stilto had forgotten here. Then he remembered Li Ju. Stiletto noted that he saw him on the cameras. However, Li Jan was justified that he just went over and wanted to have a fun with Wilhelm. However, then Stiletto asked why he turned into justice. He decided to make an interesting proposal by Li Joni. The reincarnation into the image of justice was too suspicious. Turning a tooth, Stiletto threw him into the chromium, so she was trapped with a white Kuchigura. So, now you could return to the conversation. He wanted to learn something even at the cost of his own life. Li Ju-won asked what he was doing. Then Stiletto noted that he watched him all the time and noticed some blurred details. Therefore, Stiletto decided to look for a chrome and a student of justice, or she has friends who can copy others. And he found Li Ju. Stiletto applied a slight scratch. Li Ju annoyed that he was constantly revealing and asking herself why heroes could not avoid disclosure. He noted that she admitted Li Ju-won would not have to fight him. However, he did not want to lose his earnings, so he called his words delusional. Then they began to attack each other. Stiletto noted that Li Jan heavenly paint the forces and is not able to manage them properly. Stiletto swung his claw from his hand, and Li Zhao's barely had time to restrain him before he could strike. When Li Zhou was able to rise and stood his hand, Stiletto noted that Li Zhoni uses all the forces, however, they cannot be awakened. Heroes with awakened abilities better reveal all the potential, and their physical endurance increases significantly. The capable gift is revealed in all its beauty. However, according to Stiletto, Li JJ was unable that he could not show strength. At that time, his strength can flow into all parts of the body that wants. Li Ju lost for a moment, however. In a moment he carried Stiletto to the wall and hit him with his knee into the stomach. But suddenly, he began to permeate the pain. Stiletto mocked Li Jana, because even the child realizes that the strongest bones in the human body are in the cranial box. Li Ju still acknowledged that Stiletto is right, as soon as he received his ability to fulfill his mission and disguise well. However, all his life, his desire was to have enough strength to protect his neighbor. Therefore, you must finally use forces as intended. Li Ju swung to strike. However, Stiletto laughing again because he did not fall on him. But the purpose of Li Ju was different. In a moment, the white trap destroyed and thanked the chromium for their liberation. Then she grabbed Stiletto with black ribbons to immobilize it. According to the chromium, he had a great long-standing image on her. So, before asking him a lot of questions, it was worth studying him. But Stiletto cut the black packs by reminiscent of Chrome and Li Ji Wagu that he can use the force as he pleased. Chrome began to attack, however. Stiletto defended his bones that grew out of his hands. He separated the claw from his hand and threw it into the chromium. However, he did not hit her, and the canine was stuck in the wall by leaving cracks. The chromium scored and turned out of his possible attack. Li Ju watched the action. Stiletto fought at full capacity and did not infer the strength of the chromium. She also reduced the distance for the attack. Then Stiletto pulled out 2 teeth and threw them into the chromium to get the trap again. However, twice such a technique does not work, so it has managed to escape. He came out of her sight, however, he suddenly attacked her from her back and had to be reflected. But the knee stroke forced her to fall. Stiletto quickly went to her. However, she managed to apply the shadows to defend in the supine position. However, he was also not lost, and the black shadows of the chromium crashed against his protection from the bone. Then Chromium spoke to Stiletto that he made it seriously. She activated the shadow tsunami, which was more scary. From what was seen by Stiletto, a spell. But he mastered fear and aimed at her with a bony hand. The Chromium said calmly that he would not want the shadow behind him. He stopped. Chromium exposed that Stiletto did not really plan to destroy anyone, and that he should stop the performance. From heard by Li Ju was shocked. Stiletto could kiss the chromium fang in the chromium so that it would not move and apply a fatal stroke. However, despite the possibility, he did not. So, when asked what he really wanted, Stiletto said that he realized from the very beginning that the attempt on Justice was fatal. Suddenly, he got a memory card from his pocket. She had evidence of Li Ju's transformation into Justice. If everything was exposed, he would be accused of the first. However, unexpectedly for all Stiletto, he broke the card on the pursuits with 2 fingers and trampled it. He did not want to expose Li Ju. Then Stiletto said further that they were quite similar. The Chromium was puzzled, so Stiletto confessed that he was working as an agent on the Condor clan. The situation was so that the clan and Condor were inferior to the Nadia. After the destruction of most criminals, all began to fool from many. At the same time, he was given the task for him to penetrate the Union clan and convey all the information to his native clan. It was necessary to arrange chaos within the Union. Therefore, Stiletto suggested that the 3 of them join the clan and arrange a judgment. The Chromium was distrustful of the words of Stiletto, so she voiced aloud that they did not know, with Li Ju whether there were evidence on the map and whether there were copies of compromise. Still 2 replied that it was their right to believe him or not. However, if they do not agree to cooperate, they will become competitors for him. Li Ju asked if he understood the importance of their task with Chrome. It really was transformed into Justice, however, only to find Assassin. However, Stiletto noted that finding the Disappearer, he would be honored to finish him. This prospect seemed cool for him. Li Ju with Chromium looked at. He understood that Condor members did not redeem criminals and seek to get rid of them. However, they did not know whether they should be believed. After clarifying the plan of Stiletto Li John, he was already in front of her husband. His fake documents were not exposed, so he was accepted into the Union clan. He felt a different atmosphere compared to the clan of strays. Young heroes did not have a dress code, and their expression was manifested as ever. In a moment, Chromium appeared in a new image. Lee Ju-won noted that now she looks good without a mantle. This is quite angered. She clenched her teeth, told to stop talking and move on. Lee Jan was surprised that Chrome could not be done. In a moment they met the Pits, which was also at the stadium. She was known to the Mokpan blog so that everyone was recognized and wanted to be photographed. However, Chromium noted that the purpose of its activity is only to enrich it, so it brought it more material benefits and popularity. In a moment they met Stiletto. The plan was quite good because popular Union heroes had the right to vote and could influence the course of events. However, they were still concerned about the suspicion of Chromium due to its membership and how to gain popularity. But Stiletto had an idea. After a while, they all sat in lectures. The teacher told that awakened forces can have different shapes and course of development. However, the option is not excluded that the course will not be planned. Then the hero loses control of the mind and poses a threat to society. He suggested that students get individual training to learn how to hunt such creatures. However, most of the proposal was not interesting. Lee Ju-won stopped the teacher who was already going to move to another topic. He wanted to join the team. However, others said that he apparently went crazy. Lee Jot asked in Stiletto whether they agree, and whether they can join the training that he agreed. Later, Lee Jan and Chromium went to the training base of Justice. From time to time, Hast was trained here. However, Chromium did not understand why this place was. Lee Ju-won explained that Stiletto is right. Kaisar managed to overcome accidentally, and he would not overcome the drum if the battle was not stopped. Then he thought of money. Lee Ju-won mentioned his 18. Then he celebrated his birthday with his parents and sister Sun in the courtyard. Sona loved the absolute hero. Therefore, young Lee Jan wanted to work out and specifically reconcile her into her idol. When he managed to transform into the absolute, she almost jumped from admiration. The parents then rejoiced and called him the best brother. But suddenly, the criminal broke into the yard and destroyed the parents of Lee JJ with one blow. He searched for absolute, but did not distinguish the real from Lee Ju. Sona was in danger. That is why Lee Jan was awkwardly attacked. The offender, however, he was stronger. His sister was caught. He could only lie down and watch. All the emotions that aroused this memory of Lee Jonah concentrated in his fist and punched a column of a training room. He wanted to direct the power properly. At the same time, in his office, a man with gray hair sat in the office. He seemed fun that some joined the Union clan. Suddenly, a man with gray hair was called, and he replied that he saw that the interlocutor. He asked if they were heading here and got up from the chair. He missed someone very much. Arriving, a man with gray hair went to the den. He said it was time to feed hungry creatures. The next day, Stiletto, together with Chrome and Lee Ju-won, arrived in an abandoned building. The excitement of Chromium Lee Jart replied that he was in order. Then he asked Stiletto whether they would cope with the task. However, Stiletto reassured because of Chromium's status, they were not attached to them. However, the Chromium realized that the team should have 4 heroes. So, with the hope that Stiletto chose an awaited one who would join them. Instead, she patted the Yamni on her shoulder. Lee Ju-won scared, but she was happy to be friends with the Chromium of her presence. She was terrified with Stiletto, why his choice fell on the Yam, but he calmly explained that her popularity will help them hide their personalities. But the Pits had to know about their intentions, so Lee Ji was spanned. However, she did not realize the plan and thought that they were also blogging. Stiletto said what they needed to split. Lee Ju-won wanted to be paired with Chromium. However, he refused and said to be with Yamni. Stiletto explained that she could better teach Lee Ju a safe awakening, and since they do not fully trust him, the Chromium can follow him. When the team was divided by Lee Jan, it began to think about the shapes and abilities of the Yamni. However, he thought aloud, so he had to justify himself for words. The Yamni asked what his superpower and told that her abilities were to eat dishes, after which she became stronger. As she asked why she became the hero of the Yamni, what she wanted to eat and be popular. When asked how to awaken the abilities of the Yamnia, did not know the explanation. However, she advised to think of Lee Ju-won whatever he would like to do, even if it's little thing. He analyzed it because the Yamni was stronger than him. Suddenly, she heard the sounds behind the wall and said, "Lee Chi, wait." And indeed, she was a chunky green criminal. They looked like to fight. As soon as Lee Jo-won wanted to ask the Yamnia to conceal, she began to eat the bars loudly. He was very scared because she could call the monster. From panic, Lee John shouted to stop eating the Yamnias, so she asked why. Then the offender finally heard them and headed them. Then the Yamni activated the abilities and jumped out of shelter. She struck the gadget, and the pink radiance swept his body. Lee Ju-won mentioned her words that food gave her strength. He noticed that her overweight was burned together with struck. It was her superpower. However, the offender did not die down, so she calculated how much calories she would spend and struck another blow. However, he then gave Drapak from the battlefield. Then the Yamni ran to catch up with the pagan and said Lee Jaza to contact the rest. As soon as he reached the phone, he got something dirty. It turned out that a man with gray hair turned into a mud and stole the phone. He neutralized him, saying that Lee Ji-won would not contact his friend. Lee Ji-won understood that he needed chromium and stiletto and ran his phone, but a man with gray hair was threatened with a knife to the rib. Lee Ji-won reflected from the attack by his hand. However, his blow was felt differently than usual. The gray-haired man asked where the Yamnia went to the Yamni because he noted that he would be more interested in competing. He was not entertained. A man with gray hair realized that the Yamnia teaches the awakening of Li Ju, so he intimidated that not all heroes can withstand this test. He just helped such heroes a little, but realizing that a gray-haired man made monsters Li Ju won, he prepared to give a puffy. After the first attack of a man with gray hair, Lee Jonah, he received a portion of muddy on his hand. He immediately got into his mouth and spat again. Having tried to get rid of his Lee Jonah, he realized that he would not break away. The gray-haired man boasted that his swamp may be stronger than the tire imposed. Turning once more, Lee Joni was covered with a bog on his shoulders. Then he decided to apply a crown reception and reduce the distance to strike. However, a man with gray hair was necessary. Lee Ju's hand, she punched her body through and stuck in it, and a gray-haired man suffered pain. Then he hit Lee Ju in her head and began to actively attack close. Lee Ju-won became angry and decided to use more ability. However, behind the back of a man with gray hair appeared, but the same giant criminal is green but yellowish. Once upon a time, he was a person. The gray-haired man said that the yellowish criminal painted it. However, such as Lee Jo-won, he had a pile, and his tactics are primitive. In a moment, criminals appeared around them. As a man with gray hair said, all those who were against him turned into dozens of monsters. But he missed the Yamnia, so he went to her, leaving Li Ji-shi on the monsters of whom he created. They were too strong to strike them. Li Jan tried to turn away from the blows, but a new attack was chatting every second. He covered his head while the monsters beat him on his back and shoulders. At the same time, he thanked the blue criminal because due to his last blow, the swamp disappeared and it became easier to move. Li Jan tried to attack the monsters with all his own strength, despite all loads and threats from all sides. However, there were too many of them to cope on their own. One of them released his tongue, but Li Ji was able to reflect. Still, all his strength was not enough. Meanwhile, the Yamni overcame the green criminal. She regretted that she did not start at the time of the struggle, but her new friend still did not reveal herself. She noted that Stiletto and Chrome should already be there yet. However, the Yamni wrote off everything for normal late. Suddenly, a man with gray hair arrived. He began to say that he belonged to the team and praised her struggle without help. The gray-haired man asked whether she saw Li Ju, because he allegedly wanted to convey something to his team, and fled sharply. Looking at the green monster, he was disappointed in him because he thought that the offender would handle better. But she did not stop the Yam and asked who he belonged. The gray-haired man was strongly puzzled. After analyzing his clothes and behavior with the monster, he suggested that the Yamni from the Union clan called him. However, the Yamni explained that she would remember him because the Stripple has a good memory. During the meeting of the new ones, it was not there, and it seemed suspicious. As soon as a man with gray hair wanted to add Yamni to the collection, she activated the superpower and stated that to touch the fans without permission, impolite. The gray-haired man returned and looked at the oily arm that flew from the pink beam and stuck to the wall of the house. Yamnia planned to take a break for a snack and gain strength. However, you will have to burn more calories to neutralize a gray-haired man. At this time, Li Jan was still struggling with monsters. He hoped that at least a piece of humanity remained in their mind and should fight extremely carefully. However, over time, he noticed that their behavior was built on reflexes. So, if they do not think reasonably, it was possible to apply a new technique. Although the monsters were quite strong, nevertheless, Li Jan was able to direct their hand in the right direction and repel them. He asked if possible healing monsters. Because they were able to turn from people into Gentiles, it may have been a reverse way without bloodshed. But Chromium noted that they are no longer people, and there were no cases of healing. They were the same as the criminals, so Stiletto advised to destroy them without a doubt. The monsters, not only that they turned not on their will, so they were used for the purposes of a pagan. So Li Jo sought to end that time and forever. At this time, the Yamni asked the gray-haired man or he did something with Li Ju-won. Instead, he replied that he may have been overcome by monsters. However, he liked the strength of the Yamnias, so he wanted to lure it to himself. He promised that she would not have to feel cruel. But the Yamnias were regretted that the gray-haired man could not be buried, and said to him that his words were a solid delusion. He sent his mud streams directly on her, and then she realized the peculiarity of his abilities. She began to move away, but a man with gray hair applied her favorite glowing tactic. But the Yamnia small trumps in the sleeve, so she activated a powerful pink fiery ball that struck a gray-haired man. Having suggested that her energy was very spent on such attacks, she would not have been fighting this way for a long time. However, it replenished the energy with bars. She could continue to struck until she could taste the treats. However, a man with gray hair was gathered as she was constantly distracted by food. In the end, his patience flashed and he sent powerful mud streams on the pit. She wanted to destroy them superpowers, but even more locked. The gray-haired man explained that she was trapped and expressed the mercy with the pits when she was in his wash. From this, he even more wanted to pick her up to himself. However, Li Jan came suddenly to rescue to make sashimi from him and protect the pits, but it did not scare a man with gray hair. He was tired of seeing Li Ju, especially after its defeat. However, Li Jandarim came up with the Yamni how to apply a new successful tactics. Meanwhile, Hista went along the corridor to the training base of Justice. She was sad that Li Ji did not tell him in a new clan. Suddenly, she saw the guard and asked if everything was fine. He replied that he could not go into the room so far because it was likely that Justice was there. Angry, the Hot opened the door. Everything was crushed and cracked. In her head, there was only the question of what he did the way that destroyed the premises. A man with gray hair laughing stated that he should listen and thank for advice. In his opinion, the power of Li JJ is powerless against him. Still, Li Jono intrigued the gray-haired man who would not really know. So, he agreed to try and began to spit. Focusing, Li Juwagu wrapped his asphalt with his hand and threw him in front of him as a shield that the muddy would not touch his body. Still, a man with gray hair did not give up and sent jet mud on different sides. He laughed because Li Juinab could not fight. But Li Jan said that he did not feel the difference before and after he feels. So, he revealed the swamp and said that a gray-haired man would be overflowing. He did not understand how Li Jan was able to free himself from the dirt. Although Li Jan was a little stronger, and he still reassured himself that the blows were not acting on him. However, his confidence broke into when Li Joni dispersed a gray-haired man into a pile of pieces with one blow. Then he realized that there was only one way to win. A man with gray hair awakened and enveloped Li Jo with a mud storm. He made fun of Li Jan that he would proudly perish in the flow of swamp. He really was much more, but he was able to release himself. Realizing that soon a man with gray hair can dry, he wanted to give a drop hawk. However, Li Ju-won did not want to let him go out of the battlefield. Then he began to decorate his situation by the fact that Li Ju-won would take more than 100 years to overcome him, but Li Ju-won could use more strength. He still does not control all the capacity of abilities. However, the mentor once said it was important to concentrate the strength at the right time. Therefore, without spending the energy before that, Li Ji-won was able to concentrate the maximum force in Magnum and finally neutralize the gray-haired man in one blow. Meanwhile, Stiletto and Chromium were exploring the territory. Stiletto noted that she was too cautious, however. The Chromium replied that there was no reason to relax. She then asked Stiletto why he had an alliance if the slogan of his clan was destroyed by criminals, but he replied that she did not know her time. Suddenly, the Chromium noticed that the only building of all had on the light, so they went to explore whether there was something suspicious. Stiletto destroyed the chain on the door, and they went inside. At first glance, it was a regular class without suspicious signs. However, turning off the light supply, it turned out that the power generator is elsewhere. It was quite amazing, so they searched. Finding the armored door, Chromium knocked them out. However, there were capsules and various experiments inside. It frightened Chrome and upset Stiletto, considering the room showed that horrible experiments were conducted here. After reading the documentation, it was confirmed that the premises were a bio-laboratory. The Chromium paid attention to the enabled computer, however, it stood a password. She was already thinking of carrying evidence in Atrium, however, Stiletto unlocked the system. Chrome, as he introduced a password, however, he noted that all 53 lost subjects were heroes who had not yet awakened. Still, she broke the keyboard from February and repeated the question of which Stiletto tried in every possible way. Meanwhile, Li Jan, looking at the mutilated road, noted that he may have overdone forces. However, suddenly he remembered the rescue of the Yam. As soon as he came to her, it turned out that she was quietly lying in the mud. Li Ju-won wondered that the monsters were too much and it smells fried. Looking at the seat, he saw the right. The The man at the other end of the wire asked Hidoro of a stranger. As it turned out, the so-called the gray-haired man. Lee Ju-won did not get lost and reincarnated into Hidoro. As it turned out, a man found two people in the laboratory, therefore furnished her explosives. From the excitement of Lee Ji, he issued that he was a false Hidoro. However, this was not important. It was necessary to rescue Chromium and Stiletto immediately. Meanwhile, the enmity between them increased. Stiletto swung to strike the Chromium because he did not want to tell where he knows the password from the computer. However, unexpectedly the bones of the stellate were opened, and the ground under them shuddered. There was someone in the laboratory who staged a collapse of the building. The debris fell on Chromium, and Stiletto he flew to computers, but he was pressed by one of the debris. From understanding what happened, Chrome shouted his name. A blue-haired man came out of the dust curtain. He was illuminated that she arrived in the laboratory, and it was the Chrome that was sent from the Union clan. She answered angry that she would be interested to hear about the Shinobi chore. However, he replied that there was no point in, because this place would be her scaffold. 10 years ago, Kim Soyeon, which once was the Chromium of the Little Dream, she transferred the money in the envelope and hid them between the pages of the book. Suddenly, her mother Juhan's mother came to the room and asked Kim-san whether she was going to school. On her face, swelling on the eye was clearly visible. These were common domestic violence, so Joni asked for her. However, Kim Sonyeon was annoyed as Juhan's John has nothing to apologize. One of the teachers asked Kim Soyeon, or she was confident in the choice, because she could enter the most prestigious university. However, she needed to work. After Kim Sanon's school, a girlfriend who heard the conversation for the door and asked why the teachers became so good to her, but the answer hid in the estimates. When it came to vacations, they told how they would be held. Daddy girlfriends constantly staged camping. Kim Sun spent time with her family at home. Saying goodbye to her girlfriend, she ran to work. Kim Sun asked for lateness, and dressing the apron took up the replacement of coal in the grill with forceps. Having worked the change, the manager paid her work. Walking on Kim Sona Street, she transferred the amount and rejoiced that she collected for a removable apartment for them with her mother. However, when she returned home, she caught an angry father with scattered rachima. He said that Joni Yan left home and did not know where the money came from. Kim Sona suggested that she could take money from her hiding place and ran to check books. Searching for each of its theory was confirmed. However, his father did not like that everyone was ignored and asked Kim Son where Joni Myeon went to his feet. Kim Soyeon was just begging for escape. Suddenly, the black shadows pushed his father from her. Kim Soyeon wondered that the power of the shadows really belonged to her. The father, however, was frightened to remove the shadows. However, Kim Soyeon has changed. Her nails blackened and the hair changed color. She sought to get rid of him as he turned them with his mother's life into hell. Now the Chromium stood in front of a blue-haired man. He noted that she was popular in the clan. Even Justice itself noted her ability. The blue man was still interested in whether she intentionally gave Kaisar to catch herself. However, the Chromium raised the conditions that only she would ask the question. Then he touched the walls to show what he was capable of, and she collapsed. Chromium realized that his power was the destruction of objects by one touch. Then she decided that it would not hurt her to fight him at a distance. Still, she was wrong because a blue-haired man also destroyed strength. Its shadows were destroyed in a second with part of the clothes. Then, taking advantage of the moment, he approached the naive Chrome and touched her forehead. But suddenly he arrived on the aid of Lee Jian-won and hit a blue man. He had no right to touch his girlfriend, so he was ready to fight. When Lee Jian hit him, he got the same lesion as Chromium. A blue-haired man pointed to him that he was given the same mistake as she. Lee Jonah used the moment, and without listening to his monologue, he hit a blue man. He, in turn, was surprised by his power and attack, so he used his favorite technique to stop Lee Ju. The blue-haired man touched the wall and smashed it with green sparks. Lee Ju-won understood the features of his strength and again went on the offensive, but a blue-haired man touched his first and his clothes began to collapse. She had two ways in Lee. He could focus on a counter, offensive, or defense, but in the end, he decided to choose the first option. Lee Jonah activated Magnum Awakening and struck a blue-haired man. He realized that Lee Jin was concentrated on the attack, so he had a plan. The blue-haired man took right and asked Hetero or collected all the samples. Hetero was still transformed into a puddle, but answered in the affirmative. Lee Ju-won realized that the blue-haired one asked to fight, so I wanted to strike again. However, he destroyed the floor that Lee Ji fell with Chrome. In the meantime, she remembered her past. Kim Soyeon screamed to his father that everything is because of him. However, he pleaded to stop and promised not to harm. But Kim Soyeon was in the midst of rage and stated that such a freak as he should rot in the ground. Then the black shadows flew straight into the father. Suddenly, Justice appeared between them. He spoke to Kim Soyeon that understands her mental pain, however, to wish someone death is wrong. But Kim Soyeon was dissatisfied with the position of Justice. In her opinion, he did not understand her position, so he ordered him to close a pellet and stay alone. However, Justice explained that her father did not deserve an ambulance. If Kim Soyeon agrees, he can teach her to direct the forces into the right direction. Sleeping her eyes with chromium seemed like justice. Instead, she saw Lee Ju and called herself stupid again. Lee Jan tried to jam to the chromium to come to her senses. However, she fainting lay on the ground and did not move. Suddenly, he remembered that he had not seen Stiletto. He could not escape on the battlefield. However, Lee Jan saw his hand look out of the debris. Lee Ji-won began to randomly rake the rubble alone, realized that they had so much to survive. Everyone who knew Lee Ji-won walked away. Suddenly, Stilet shouted that thanking the glass, but he was still with them. Lee Ju-won began to laugh nervously that he had no doubt. One Stiletto began to get up suspiciously, and it scared Lee Ju. Stiletto had to tell him something important. A nurse came out soon. Lee Ju-won asked if it was possible to enter the chromium and what she was ill, specifying that he understood the nurse's guardian, but said Kim Soyeon, though she woke up and still needed a rest. Lee Ju-won ignored the nurse's request and entered the ward. Another nurse approached her, and they started gossip together. When he went to the ward, he saw the chromium that sat on the bed. Lee Jiaos was glad that everything was fine with her, but Chrome asked not to dissolve nuns. He asked how her state of health, to what she answered. However, she coughed with blood, so she added that her organs may have been damaged. She spoke to Lee JJ that she would better rest with a broken hand, and asked him to call her a pillar. She was aware of the name Chrome. When they came to Stiletto, he breathed through the mask. Lee Jan-won explained Kim Soyeon that he had a squeezed organs and a broken spine after falling fragments. Asked why Stiletto still in this state, someone answered that he enjoyed playing hide-eyed with criminals. It was a Yamni who knew about his clan. She knew about his passion for the destruction of the Gentiles. They went to the garden together with Stiletto. Her strength immediately manifested them, but he did not have them. At the same time, he was taken for experiments and severely mocked to show ability. Now, though he possesses force, but it was given to him an expensive price. For the last 10 years, the offender has died, however. Again, be aware of himself. I did not know how to respond to the Yamnias, because she hoped to find and hurry up with it. Lee Ju was sitting in front of the house in anticipation. Despite her workout, his hand was badly damaged, and he would not hurt someone else. Suddenly, Sanshi of the Union appeared in front of him. She asked if he was fighting with criminals, and later it was about victims and unpunished criminals. Then Sanshi asked Lee Jao and Vona to give everyone something important. They should forget everything seen and experience what happened in that ill-fated laboratory. She wanted people to continue to believe that the villains were overcome. However, Lee Jan asked whether heroes should still know about the existing danger. Sanshi became angry and explained that all issues with the activation of criminals would be resolved within the clan of the Union. Therefore, their affairs should not concern anyone. Lee Ju-won understood the position of Sanshi because the Grand Clan would not be delighted. However, she would be brazen to ask for information, for which Stiletto almost died. Then she did not ask for some service, so she threatened to use the force to Lee Ju directly in the hospital. He was shocked by her recklessness. Suddenly, Viento came out and said that Sanshi could be unbearable. When she asked why he came, Viento replied that there were many fans at the entrance. Lee Ju-won remembered him. Viento worked as an actor and works in parallel with a hero for half a pawn. Its popularity is getting frantic. However, despite the praise of Lee Ju-Viento, she asked a rhetorical question about whether the new is able to cope with the problems if it reveals the truth. Lee Ju-won realized that none of the Union clans seeking to hide the facts. So, he said that for nothing, he would not reveal information, and is ready to conclude an agreement. Stiletto dressed to go outside. When the nurse asked whether he had to rest Stiletto to reassure her that his bones were quickly recovering. He did not understand why a blue-haired man seems familiar to him. However, this is for the better, because the laboratory works, and it will be able to destroy everyone. Nevertheless, he managed to find out the location of the network connection on the computer, so it was not necessary to waste time. Lee Jan and Stiletto met outside and overturned with a couple of phrases of Lee Ju-won, showed that thanks to Viento, their team popularity began to grow. Stiletto did not know why he heard his name, and asked about the things revealed. Lee Ju-won recalled that Foams and benzosusadine took away all the data. He was angry and reminded that he got to the hospital precisely because he kept his body fragments in the laboratory until they finally collapse. Stilt-Toe began to recall Lee Joni about the atrocities and experiments that lived on living people, but he tried to suspend anger and explain everything. It would be more terrible to give all the information than to conclude a deal with Bensi. Suddenly, Lee Jan was called Hast, with questions about responsibility. She took an electronic copy of the data to the penthouse. Hest asked to deal with everything else on her own and not to bother her unexpected calls. After graduating from Lee Ji, he explained that having agreed on the transfer of data, he asked Hist to make them a copy of them destroying all the evidence. Stiletto calmed down that the information remains in them, but Lee Ju Vaughn got an ampule and said that she would also agree as evidence. After a while, Lee Jan was in a scientific laboratory. He followed one of the employees and seamlessly transformed into his image. After going to the empty room, he used the skills of a research degree and conducted an underground analysis of the substance in the ampule. However, the laboratory assistant, after his back, asked if he had to go to a snack. Lee Juwan justified that he forgot to do something, and he believed in what he said. The laboratory assistant asked to submit some material, but at the bottom of the box was a collar worn by monsters. He explained that at the scene of the event was the driver fled. He was not taken away because his condition prevented him from happening, but despite the huge efforts, the laboratory assistant was able to restore the material in the box. The penthouse of justice came to the penthouse, however, that Stiletto, along with Lee Ju-won and Chrome, was sorting hundreds of papers with information obtained. For the second day, they sat and studied everything. It was impossible to miss at least one detail, even if the coincidence was illogical. Lee Jae-jin stood out of the long seat so he could not stand and went to breathe in air. 2 billion won did not cost such severe fatigue. Chrome said that she had to be a nanny again and went for Lee Jan-vona. Yamnia was puzzled that she was thrown alone as soon as she came. Stilt-2 explained that when he focuses on something for a long time, then the attention is scattered, so he should also take a break. Suddenly, the Yamni shouted that the food was above all and asked what the feasibility was ordered. In this name, Stiletto thought a little and decided to leave for a moment. The Yamni was disappointed that he also decided to throw her, but Stiletto replied that there was something to be checked, so she began to choose an order on her own. Lee Jae-won came to a meeting on a red sports electrical car. Out of him, Lee Jae-won was shocked by the justice car. Asking Lee Ju-won plans to do, he answered that he should buy new clothes. His physique has changed a lot, so old clothes did not fit him. Chromium noted that his sports style, however, Lee Ju-won waved because he dressed so because he had not enough money. Chromium decided to help him with the choice of clothes. She drove him to expensive shops and restaurants. Lee Ju-won was surprised by such considerable money. Based on the packets of Lee Ji-won noted that it was his clothes and the Chromium should be indifferent. However, she said that he should look properly with her. Lee Ju-won understood the reason when he saw Viento among the crowd of the people. He really had plenty of fans and great popularity in the Union, but he was worried that Sanshi was ready to fight him in the hospital. The Chromium wanted to answer, but Sanshi said the first that her strength acts on a separate plot. Sanshi asked why they were so interested in this business, and that they are probably a couple, but she was not worried about their relationship, so she apologized for their behavior. She explained that it is possible and looks evil and still difficult. Despite the frustration of her threats, she thanked Lee John. Chrome asked if she was normally discussing everything with them and the people, but Sanshi thought that they had discussed everything, and the Union clan was more media than the clan. When Sanny called, she said that she would look forward to them. Lee Ju-won was embarrassed, and Chromium noted that he had been in her words. She explained that before the Nemesis was damaged by all of the Union clan worked with mercenaries, including Arcadia. But now they are rather celebrity. Asked for the results of the analyses of Lee Ju-won, replied that they would not come soon. Yet, he suggested that you come and check in person, having reincarnated as last time Lee Jin came to the laboratory. However, the laboratory assistant stood behind his back, as it turned out to be re-operating. The laboratory assistant voiced that it was worth improving the device to control the ability, and asked whether Lee Ju-won was aware of him, and he denied what he knew about it. When Lee Jan asked that the laboratory assistant planned to do with a powerful device, he was informed that the results of the analyses were ready, so Lee Ju-won went to check. When he went into the computer base, he gave out that the data coincided with the previous one. The system then asked for security code. He was only known by Hess. He did not find records inside and judged he was added recently. However, he saw that the data concerned Justus and his death. As soon as Lee Ju, he realized that the criminals involved in Stiletto put his hands and he began to call to Stiletto in order to find out everything. However, he did not answer, and Lee Jan rushed to the Union's apartments. However, even there, it was not there because no one opened the door inside. Suddenly, the girl recognized Li Ju and introduced herself as Vivi. She wondered that he was acquainted with Stilet and asked where he and how long ago. As it turned out, it was not in the apartments. Only one assumption remained. He went on the road to get off with the criminals. Stiletto arrived in a place that he studied on the computer. It has not changed and was still cloudy against the background of highly developed cities. Stiletto reached the abandoned orphanage Good Heart. His mind was permeated from his childhood when he held his young years here. Then 10-year-old the Theo went with crutches for problems with the leg. However, other children stormed him and mocked him. He could not repel then. Turning to the warden for help, she said that he should be friendly with other children. However, he disagreed because he was constantly offended. The warden replied that she was talking to the abusers, but the Theo should understand that not only they are guilty of being bullied. The caregivers were worried about his health. However, he must learn to protect himself. Listening to her by the end of the can, Theo understood everything. The abusers have never understood their guilt. They continued to con Theo for turning to the warders and were convinced that he was not capable of anything. When Theo came out of the cabinet, the caretakers again dumped him from his feet, mocking him that he could not stand up and seems to be not looking at his feet. However, suddenly, the Theo threw himself on one of the abusers and began to beat the cane. The other was terribly because Theo got on a lame leg. When the caretaker left the office to look for the boys, she caught one of the abusers lying in the bruising and the Theo, which stood by the tears. Suddenly, a red-haired girl approached Stiletto and asked if this building was destroyed. However, suddenly, she reached out and asked for information. Then, getting a handful of money, Stiletto told about rumors that people seemed to be in the area and whether she knew something about these events. She packed and began to say that she knew nothing and demand her to give her money. However, Stiletto did not retreat and ordered everything. The red-haired girl asked Ben to tell information on her ear, but suddenly she spread her mouth and baked Stiletto. She turned into a terrible beast with sharp teeth and scary red eyes, and admitted that she, so to speak, to catch people. The red-haired girl asked whether Stiletto wanted to return and turned to him as a colleague. However, he said sharply that she did not know him. Then the redhead recalled that it was always used as a consumable material. Even now, they wanted to use his ability. Stiletto said that she was talking too much. He was a little lost at first, but now it's time for battle, and he grew a claw with his hand. As it turned out, in the red-haired ones were claws on the hands and legs, which she used as a tool. She cut them in every possible way. However, he was not confused, and sharp bones escaped from his shoulder muscles. The redhead did not have time to understand everything, and she hung on them above the ground. Stiletto wondered which monsters created a laboratory. Then she grabbed his hands and pushed her foot to release. Stiletto wondered how quickly her regeneration was, and in a moment she separated her hand and threw it into it. Fortunately, Stiletto managed to activate protection. However, the redhead activated the awakening of the elephant axe, so the next blow he missed and fell to the ground. She wondered that his abilities were powerless. Then the red hair struck the Stiletto in the jaw so that he rejected him well. She was mocking whether it should be taken for the breast of the bones. The redhead showed how her hand was instantly regenerated and noted that her abilities became better than yesterday. However, she asked Stiletto where he learned about the sample and reminded not of a warning not to get into business. Red Hair jumped with strong feet on Stiletto, while he defended himself with a bony shield. However, he crashed and her leg was already coming to him. But unexpectedly, Li Jin appeared on the battlefield and rejected the redhead in time. She, in turn, pierced the brick wall and found herself under the wreckage. Stiletto was surprised that Li Jin came. However, he noted that the case concerns justice, so Li Ju One would not close his eyes. When the red-haired one got out of the trap and scolded Li Ju, he again struck and dropped it. This time, the relay in the struggle is taken by Li Ji Wan. Li Ju One missed strokes and heard criticism of his movements in parallel. He could swing his fists, but did not follow the opponent and protection of his feet. Hest replied that with such training, she did not agree to teach Li Hua and hoped that he would not need a long break after the attack. He asked literally to take a little breath, so he asked why Li Ju Wog was not enough to copy the justice for money and seeks to get fully in the role. Li Ju Wan said that his family died at the hands of the monsters, and he decided to make a living by copying the heroes. However, he later changed his opinion. Although he could not protect everyone who wants, however, he would not pop up the title of the hero with the desire for material benefits. Heast was feeling it, and she answered what would help him. However, despite the very powerful power of justice, it will not be subject to. Meanwhile, he professionally struck the girl's red-haired girl and evaded the attacks at the right moment. Stiletto watched Li Jan and understood that he did not work in haste. He grew up in his eyes, and the red-haired painted with pain. Li Ju-won asked if she did not want to surrender, because he did not want to torment girls today, but she replied that it was better not to brag. The redhead activated the awakening of the elephant axe. However, Li Jen was surprised that her strength was too weak, and activated her own awakening of Magnum. But suddenly, the red-haired grown long-haired claws and left the cuts on her clothes. So she smiled again, saying that he was funny. But Stiletto replied that she was also funny, and put a claw in her back. When her back was enveloped in the bones, Stiletto noticed a label around the neck of a red-haired one. When he asked why she did not answer with them, that he was helpless, so when he had the same problems with the body, others treated him differently. After inhuman experiments, many died. However, she was to bend as she was able to reborn and become alive again. Stiletti said that this madness, however, to show that the true madness of the red-haired was activating Leviathan and turned into a monster. Li Ju-won did not have time to recover from the previous awakening of the red-haired, so, along with Stiletto, they did not know what to do. Suddenly, Li Jan saw his hand red-haired at his foot, and felt the same sparks as during the touch of justice. It has increased power at times. Despite the problems with Li Ji's hand, he was able to activate real Magnum and destroy the red hair. However, suddenly his hand was convulsive. Suddenly, she enveloped the black shadows, so he realized that it was chromium. She told the Yamen about Li Ju, so she asked everything from him. Stiletto noted that after the true manifestation of the force of justice, he would have to get well, and he himself was debt to Li Jan. Chromium was angry that they needed to be controlled all the time, however, said that the death of justice was related to the current events. Stiletto noted that he had already heard this, and Li Ju-won wanted to confirm everything. But Chromium noted that there was not a poison in the ampoule, but a stimulant of ability. Li Ju-won, together with Chromium and Stiletto, led a red-haired shirt through an atrium. She looked at the place where the characters live. The edge of the ear of Rudelos heard someone gossip that knew from the Union clan was caught by the criminal and that she was probably a regular baby. She scared the gossip, but behind her back she classed the Yamni and said that the red-haired should be a good dog. It was even more angry. To meet them, went with Sanshi with the guards. Li Ju-jin was killed because the materials were in him, but instead Sanshi said that they had coped well. The guards asked them to give them a redhead. However, Stiletto refused. Suddenly, he was grabbed by a strong migraine, and the guards thanked the cooperation. Li Ju-won asked that with him. However, he soon heard Sanshi's ultrasound that he had deceived her. She knew everything, and now conceived something. Departing from all Li Ji, he noted that the autopsy showed nothing. Chromium showed that one drop from the ampule made with her forces. Chromium shadows began to become mutated and became almost superfluous. Stiletto noted that her abilities have increased many times. People are not able to withstand the whole dose from the ampule, so it explains numerous fatal cases, so it could cause justice death. The results really spoke about the sharp activation of forces. Li Ju-won specified, or could he be powerful because of the so-called steroids? However, the chromium was objected to. The justice was able to overcome Nemesis. Even at the maximum dosage, people would not be able to overcome it. Due to the properties of fluid in the ampule, the death of justice did not cause any suspicion. It was only good to consider the target of assassins. Yamnias did not understand anything, and only now she stopped that Justice is gone. She reheaved, and Stiletto asked her to tell her later. Li Ju-won came to the Union's apartments. He sought to talk to Arcadia and to make him ask the redhead. Li Ju reported that it was possible to log in, and Arcadia congratulated him in his office. Arcadia suggested tea and coffee. However, Li Ju-won refused, so Arcadia pushed him that tea could calm him. Li Ju-won was not up to it. He reported that the clan of the Straji was known that the detainee was in a large criminal organization, so the clan asked to interrogate it. However, Arcadia, despite the logic of the appeal, did not understand that he did not suit justice. The red-haired one was crazy and not like the offender. But Li Ju did not retreat and replied that Arcadia knew no worse than him that the threat of a red-haired one posed himself. Arcadia, however, translated the topic that it is just enough for the clan to fight with. So, it was advantageous to take a red-haired one. Li Ju-won realized that nothing came of the dialogue, and there was no point in delaying. Arcadia was surprised that he did not defend the position as he usually did. Meanwhile, leaving the apartments of Li Jan, he called and replied that he would return to the old scheme. It's time for justice to work. When Sanshi took the red-haired one with her, all were disappointed. She purposefully went as if she had invented some insidious plan. All hopes were lost, and the only way out was to rely on justice. Yamnia thought that Arcadia should ask him. However, the clan of the Soviets was not in the best shape. even with the #1 hero. The alliance was mocked on money, so it was only stronger. Lee Ju-won invented a plan to solve something and announced what would go to Arcadia. The chromium was to ask only if everything would be fine. After a while, chromium was already read in the library. In a moment, Jujin was told and asked how she was given to teach newcomers. Yudazin explained that it was possible to become their scout and receive a decent salary. Chromium replied that this is a good chance and she would cope. Jujin hoped to see her more often. However, the letter received from the Yamnia referred to a temporary stop of their activity by the legal department of the Union. The encouraging thoughts of Chrome interrupted the noise from the crowd. One of the heroes asked if she was involved, and specified that Justice was training. In a moment, the door broke up, and almost a tired Marxie fell out of them. Lee Ju-won said the training has not yet ended and it should return. In the course of their battle, Lee John evaded her rays and clearly pointed to her mistakes. Lee Ju-won managed to be a good teacher. Chromium thought that it was not just a workout. Lee Ju-won improved his skills, and everyone liked it. Thus, I finished 2 rabbits. At the end of the chromium classes, she specified or not self-confident to fight the characters. Lee Ju-won said that the rich rating was falling. Chromium looked at the questionnaires in the tablet. Most talented heroes were translated or left the clan forever. But Chromium noted that only workouts will not help to return talented heroes. But Lee Joes noted that he would not only train the heroes. He remembered Kim Sun, who was talented from the new school. Chromium asked if he implies that talented heroes were simply not happy in recognition. He burned the page in the tablet and asked to transmit the following information to the Yamni and Stiletto. But what she saw is heavily shocked. The Chromium was stunned with whether he was ready to go so far away, and Lee Ju with excitement answered that she wanted to rub his nose to arrogant members of the Union. In the evening, a red-haired conductor of the wagon greeted the driver on the platform of the train. He asked the conductor to leave something in the depot. The red-haired conductor fulfilled the request and eaten the coal that got out of the bag. His hat began to smoke, and the train moved on. Tired of the end of the working day, the red-haired conductor thanked the man for his hard work. But suddenly he was angry with Lee Jin and invited him to talk. At the table, the conductor asked him whether he was sure that the sentence was correct. He had to work in a strange subway, and it was abyssal. The conductor specified in Lee JJ she or he in the Union's clan, and noted that, despite his unsuccessful attempts, he changed quite much. Lee Ju-won replied that as his ability turned out to be the change of appearance, and not in transformation. The conductor said that he would like that, but Lee Jan stopped his complaints about life, and stated that he had come, not just. He asked to wait, and the conductor thought to refuse him. However, justice came to him, which asked for a cover under the mask. He noted that the leader did not like membership in the Union. After the proposal to join the Grand Clan, the conductor wanted to refuse. However, Lee Ju-won suggested to increase the 200 Vona. The conductor was illuminated by the very thought how much you can buy train. Despite the misunderstanding of the connection of justice with Lee Ju-wa-gu, the leader still agreed. Meanwhile, a meeting was held in the office. Viento said that this quarter of the Union's profits increased by 13%, and the clan would develop further. Everyone was delighted with the prospects of the Union and praised it. However, Viatanto tried to endure the time at the meeting. Coming to the office, he reincarnated into Arcadia and voiced his dissatisfaction with each of the heroes. But suddenly a servant came into the news. Arcadia annoyed his visit, so he wanted to postpone the case for later. However, the involvement of the Guard of Urgent News interested him. The members of the clan of the Guards conducted aggressive agitation, and this led to the outflow of heroes. Arcadia also learned that most of them were above average. Realizing that the number of them did not overcome Arcadia, to raise the bet so that Justice could not realize the plan. Meanwhile, Lee Ju-won asked for heist money. It was raging because they did not constantly give away resources. He did not know about the budget of the clan of the Guard. However, Lee Ju-won stated that the money was already in his pocket. He explained that he saw how many talented heroes were in the Union. However, because of the horrific system, they do not get the best rating. Heist was made up of the fact that Lee Jan plans to invest his own money in the newly arrived heroes. However, he denied her theory. In fact, it is an investment in the future of the clan of the Guards to make more money. Then Hest advised to start with Red. She explained that this hero was the left hand of justice, and other heroes would pull up behind him. However, there was a clash between them, and now Red is retired. Hest did not know the details, but noticed that he would be useful. Lee Jan suddenly suggested that he may be involved in the death of Justice, However, Hest reassured him that Red was just as committed to justice, but she still took the suspicions, so she decided to start exploring more information before interrogation. Hest agreed but noted that the Red rather strange hero. Arriving at Li Ji-won found himself in the wild. He remembered that he lived in a cheap apartment with inconveniences. He needed to reach the third floor. Suddenly she approached the elderly person and asked to pass the package through her sick knees. Li Ji-won did not understand how a strange person can bring packages. However, all the questions disappeared when he saw the huge mountains of boxes under the door. Asking if it was possible to enter, he found that the door was open. The apartment was very dark, and Li Ju came inside. Questioning whether someone is inside, he turned the light in the room. In the middle of her in the inflatable pool lay a man in a helmet. Li Jae-an asked, what worried about counting, that he had confused the apartments, but the man in helmet ordered to stop. He got out of the pool and put his hand on his shoulder, greeted him by calling him a captain. Li Ju-won wondered how strange the Red was. He suggested that in the old good times do something, and suddenly applied a burning blow. It was clearly not super abilities. Red wanted to continue, however. Li Ju-won stopped him and asked if he did not want to join the guard. Red was dissatisfied. Lee Jonah said that their thoughts may have swept their thoughts and that there are more important things. However, Red said that he was evading their explanations throughout the month. Red had nothing to say if Lee Ju-won does not want to explain everything. So, without waiting for the answers, Red put him out the door. Lee Ju-won still did not understand what was happening. Just a month ago, Eustace contacted him, so everything became more suspicious. After the unsuccessful guests, Red went to save the locals from slight difficulties and pull the carts. But suddenly he met Viento. He invited him to coffee, saying that she was the best in the city, and asking why the establishment has no franchise. But after a sip of coffee, he understood the cause, but Red stopped Viento. So, later he reached out an envelope with an invitation to the union. Viento explained that the clan did not want to help, but Red could protect the area as a colleague. However, he noted that everything would turn into the nozzle. When Viento hit the topic of the lull of justice, the Red finally broke out. He poured coffee in thanks for the invitation. Suddenly, he heard a thief in the city and rushed to rescue. However, he was suddenly stopped by heavy force and he fell. Instead of applying Euron, the force has struck. Red did not understand why Vienna stops him. Then he explained that the area has a successful location, so the profit could increase. However, if the Red is busy, then the criminals take care of everything. From this, Red stated that Viento went crazy. Then he again applied forces and said that he was annoyed by the Red One. Viento wondered that despite the ray, he could still stay and stand in place. However, this made it possible to win time to destroy the infrastructure and reduce the value of the city. Suddenly, Viento ceased to hear the noise and noticed that his offender was destroyed. In a moment, Li Ju-won appeared and stated that he could damage Viento's hand if he did not drop it. Viento was frightened, but he justified that Red began to take self-acting actions on the territory of the Union clan, so he had to take measures. Red exclaimed that all this is a full delusion. A couple of minutes ago, he saved the development and now talks to some delusion. Li Ju-won wanted to speak to Viento, but Red interrupted him. Even after the last operation, he ignored the Red. It looks like a former Justice. Viento was indifferent to the chats. In his opinion, it is clear that money is the key to success. Therefore, he rejoiced when Li Jae-in reached out. However, he asked or remembered Viento the hero of the superhuman in the tournament and said that everything was now, and Li Ju, he twisted his hand as promised. He then hit Viento mechanically and turned to Red, or he still thinks that their quarrel is a misunderstanding. Li Ju-won apologized to him and explained that he has been disappointed in the characters lately, so if he does not mind, his proposal is still in force. Red rejoiced that the former justice still returned and wanted to repeat friendly battles as once. One Li Jan was refused. Red emphasized that the Grave Clan was still not enough resources, so Li Ju-won reassured it that he plans to apply the Union Clan strategy. 2 days later, Arcadia thought everything in his chair. At the next meeting of the heroes, he should be silent for the incident because he was the initiator. However, it was little worried, so he asked the assistant how many new heroes joined. None of them chose a clan of the Union. He refused to believe that the superhumans were leading, but it was a matter of guard. Arcadia was angry that they managed to such results. Suddenly, the glass was struck behind him. The assistant was aware that it was a new offender who was doing chaos and whom no one was able to overcome. Vivi, with the partner, tried to destroy the offender with their own abilities. After the victory, he spoke to the Viva that they coped. However, she did not have time to agree as her partner hit the offender. He threateningly put before Vivi, so she escaped from the scene. In fact, it was Li Ju-won. He activated the special power of the voice and frightened the heroes with his potential. From the flurry, he got the ability to manipulate the body. Thus, Li Jin was able to become greater, and his ability to copy gave him appearance. However, by adding justice, he was invincible in his own way. Arcadia ran outside, however. Li Juwan quickly rejected him. Subsequently, he put himself from a criminal, and, despite the illegality of his actions, the case was worth it. Red asked if he really plans to be like an alliance. Li Juwan explained that they were constantly ridiculed for the honesty of the guard, so it was necessary to change it. He swore that he would not be in danger of civilians, but will only harm infrastructure. Therefore, during the operation, Red turned to a team of newcomers who did not know what the captain thinks, but they need to be alert. Li Jian wrapped everything that he considered materially valuable to the Union clan and so panicked. The assistant lay helplessly on the ground. However, Vion sharply grabbed her and ran away. She thanked him for salvation. However, suddenly the building collapsed and they began to fall. Viento applied forces and ordered the assistant not to whine. Rescue was only for the sake of benefit. She looked with horror at Viento concentrating and saying that people would suffer, but he sneezed for everything and sought to overcome the offender. Viento kissed the offender, and the building really began to collapse on people. However, Li Jian managed to put his hand to seam El Kodor. Viento looked and did not understand as the offender had time to recover so quickly. Even Banshi's sister could not regenerate as he was. In a moment, he saw the new ones of the guard and ordered them to be stopped, as they could not cope. But they did not listen to him. The hero used the awakening of the carpet, and the former train leader was saturated with coal and hit the pink ray with the offender. Red Li, Juhoon's eyes soon blocked and ordered Maxri to attack. With her manifestation, she hit the yellow beam. Finally, Red used secret weapons. He threw a burning bomb in Li Ju and said that the title of burning was given only to the elect. All people were delighted with the clan, and concluded that the Union is only a celebrity team that is not capable of anything. Viento was crushed. Li Ju-won viewed news in the office. In a moment, an angry Arcadia broke into him and announced that he knows everything perfect. The offender was attacked only on the Union clan, and, from some coincidence, only the guards were able to overcome him. He demanded to stop everything. However, Li Ju did refuse. The heroes of the Union could not handle so. Their commerce seems pathetic. Therefore, the request of such a team will be fulfilled. Li Ju-won recalled that the Union assured the presence of only small bandits. However, it was not clear why the members of the Union did not stop the offender. Arcadia saw in his words threats because much has happened recently with the participation of the clan. But Li Ju-won proposed an agreement. He sought to interrogate the flurry, but Arcadia recalled that they should have eliminated everyone after the last operation of clearing the headquarters of the criminals. However, Li Jian and Fistinian noted that it would not have been meaningless if his words were really meaningless. Chromium and Li Ju-won arrived in the colony of Persephone criminals. Chromium noted that, despite the large area, she under strict supervision. Persephone has all the most famous criminals, including Nemesis. As it turned out, the population continues to claim the rights of people. Then Chromium told that the energy of criminals was collected in separate containers. Thus, in addition to restraining criminals, there are many advantages from devices. Suddenly, the Chromium confessed that Nemesis could not be executed. On that day, they tried to do justice and triumph. When Chromium and Li Zhou came to the Shlom scholars, the guard announced the rules of conduct and supervision of dialogue, and Li Daiwan came inside without Chromium. First of all, he examined the control device of criminals, and the flurry asked if he was afraid of his own safety. Li Ju-won asked if she was a subject and what she wanted to do with Stiletto. She said that he was among them and she wanted to meet. The Chromium was worried that the flurry calmly responded. However, it was more worried that Li Ju-won was talking about the death of justice. Li Jie asked if she wanted a flurry, but she answered what he did not want to. However, in a moment, she noticed a crack on the device of restraint. She changed his position sharply and promised to tell a bit, but instead the flurry of the device and attacked Li Ju. She thought he would not have time to react, but he asked if she did not believe that he came to her at the beginning just like that. In fact, he broke the device himself, and the flurry helped him get rid of the supervision of outsiders. So now he demanded the information holding her for the throat. While the Chromium was interrogated, she asked the caretaker near or questioned the curtain. He answered in the affirmative, however, he indicated that she did not want to contact. In a moment, the glass for the supervision cracked, and the cameras with the sound turned off. The caretaker called the operational service, and the Chromium was surprised by the plan of Li Ju. As soon as Skarwar asked if he had something to hide it on the wall, with threats. However, it would be more scary to hear it from Condor clan members. Then Li Jonah grabbed her, her even more surprised because everyone was forbidden in the chamber. However, he explained that she was the first attacked on him, and he justified that he did not calculate the strength during the defense. Then the flurry did not stand, and confessed that the chromium once met with Michael, who made a defeat in the laboratory. When the operational service arrived at the place, she detained the flurry and asked the condition of Li Ju. He only noted that they needed to improve protection. When he went out to the chromium, he said to the question about information that he said to never explain something and what to talk to Heast. Meanwhile, an assistant arrived in Arcadia. He reported that the flurry was crushed, but Viento persuaded a snippet of videos from cameras. When he noticed that Li John got on the camera when he touched the device, laughing wildly. At this point, Sanchi came to the office. He began to explain that Heast had penetrated the Union, however, it could still be beat as a defeat of a guard. However, the merged information was not in their hand. He did not like that she was detained by a flurry, so Arcadia raised San high, causing pain above the ground and asking why she prevented him. Arcadia recalled that she had already made mistakes, and whether Banshee liked to get scars near her mouth. Arcadia turned on the video and recalled how the Bonzi Union was praised at the global collection of the Banshee Union, so he asked if she was specifically substituting his reputation. However, Banshee replied that she only tried to reduce the horrific consequences for the Union. Arcadia mockingly asked why he could barely hear it. However, he remembered that after one incident, she had to wear a mask. In the end, he for the last struck Banshee because she was doing well, and in a timely manner. Arcadia only asked if she would be obedient to him. When she came to Viento Banshee, she gave the mask and asked Zeus to repair her. Viento was sorry to look at her. He apologized to Banshee because she did not ask for help, and wished that he could always do what he always. Meanwhile, Chrome and Li Ju 1 arrived at the penthouse number, where they were waiting for Hast and Stiletto with the Yamni. Hest asked why she needed. At that time, Li John said that the flurry told that together with Sanchi, they were experimental copies and showed abilities thanks to the expansion. She did not know who created him, but in order not to die, that Michael sought to arrange a large-scale attack. Stiletto was not sure that those mutants who were in the laboratory could have such a blow. However, everyone in the room was unknown what Michael thought. Meanwhile, Viento was angry at Arcadia for abuse of Nuna. If he could overcome the offender, she would not have been tortured again. Suddenly, the pharmacist entered Viento and asked to confirm the development of a new drug that gave strength. Viento did not know about him, but he was immediately interested. He refused to give approval and suggested that he investigate it more carefully. While he kept the drug, he understood what power he had now gained. Finally, he will have the strength to protect Nuna. However, the pharmacist ran out of the building and drove the mask and broke his glasses into the yards. As the pharmacist turned out to be Michael. Viento checked half of the dose of the drug, and the result was pleasantly impressed. However, it was unpleasant for Arcadia to sit on their pants unlike them. After training, Vivi came to the hall and praised Viento's ability. He thanked and remembered that the blonde helped to burn the gum brand. Viento asked if she also wanted to train, and Vivi confessed that she was anxious about the thought that her abilities were not progressing. Viento tried to assure her that as long as the advertising was working, however, the babble reminded the experience of Wilhelm, which lost popularity. Then he remembered what Vivi saw during the last battle with the criminal, and suggested a reliable method of improving his ability. In the morning, Li Jan was thinking about a large-scale attack. Although his strength was enough, and the Heast would put his guard with him anxious. He did not pay attention first, however, as Red Justice said, and really died in the last month of life, and it seemed suspicious. The location of Justice cannot be traced, so he checked his phone and found that he often visited Konmin at the 2 o'clock. Li Juwan asked Stiletto to go with him, to ensure the situation despite the fact that he now became the manager of Yamni on her blog. Going to Li Jujan's elevator, it was late to realize that it would be worth reincarnation, so that it was not necessary to be exposed to Wilhelm as he was. Suddenly, they met one of the women, and Stilto began to justify that they were wrong. However, Li Ju won and the woman recognized each other. Stiletto did not understand what was happening, but everything was easier. Li Ju Wan has not seen someone from the family for a long time, in particular, her, Nuna. Meanwhile, in the hetero laboratory, he tried to reassure the hungry monsters. He threw pieces of meat and organs for which they fought. When Hidoro came to Michael, he asked how much he would still have to feed them, and whether they would be enough for the attack. Michael replied that the monsters would not cope, but reassured Hidoro by the fact that there were some other people to help. He meant Viento and Vivi. At this time, there was an uncomfortable pause in Nunu's office. Stiletto had little believed that Li Ji-won and Nuno's relatives, but decided not to interfere with them and go away. It took a long time, so Li Ju's question, she was out of place. In order to avoid inconvenience, she suggested talking somewhere. They came to the hospital. Li Ju-won was amazed by the fact that Nuno works as a director here and receives respect from employees. Suddenly, one of the doctors called Nuna to the operating room because they got a difficult case. On the bed lay a boy with polyhogran insufficiency and numerous injuries from beating by a car. Nuna applied healing forces and removed all the consequences of the accident. When the boy was conscious, he was much better, and he thanked her for the salvation. Li Ju-won has not seen her strength for a long time. Some said that she could even resurrect a person. However, it became worse than the use of force. Li Ju-won asked if this happened constantly, but she said that he was spending time on medicine research to treat patients without the use of forces. Nuna asked if he was in the Union clan. However, Li Ju-won replied that it was a long story, but now went to the guard. She did not understand their needs for heroes. However, Li Jan, he switched to the topic that Justice hired him as a replacement and would like to meet her personally. Nuna didn't know why he could not come personally. However, having heard that she needed to come to the guard, she guessed that Justice was killed. In the office of Li Ju-won asked why Nuna suggested it, but she knew that he was twisting. Nuna said that he needed to know the cause of Justice's visit. Li Ju-won confessed to the death of Justice and that he replaces him. She was angry that he got involved in it, but he thundered that he did not like it. Li Jan continued that Assassina was looking for her, and thought that Nuna could know something if she guessed everything right away. She told that he treated Justice. However, during his last visit, he was much worse. Nuna didn't know what she would turn. Then Li Jan asked her about the drug that exacerbated the strength, but Nuna replied that she did not prescribe any medication. But she also remembered that the Trium asked her, or went to the hospital. Li Ju-won was suspicious of his activity. He was constantly stitched at Justice, even during the overcoming of the nemesis. Nuna interrupted his thoughts and asked if he could look at the body of Justice. In the morgue, Chromium opened a chamber of Justice and asked why the Doctor of Justice came here, but in Li JJ she did not have specific answers. He noted that for the first time he sees the morgue of heroes and told that only Justice and guards were in it. Therefore, from Nuna, she is not delighted. Suddenly, she was thought of that she may have seduced Li Ju, as well as Hista, and now plans to do something evil. However, Li Jan replied that he was no longer doing that, and Nuna his older sister. At that time, the Chromium calmed down and no longer felt a threat. However, soon, Nuna applied forces and pink light blinded them. Li Ju-won did not expect it, so she asked what she had done with Justice. Nuni failed to resurrect Justice, and the cells that managed to restore over time to return to the former state. She then asked if she could pick up the skin of Justice, because they could help in the experiment of what Justice he agreed for life. However, when Chromium heard that there was no written evidence in Nuna, she asked how to trust them angrily. But in the end, Nuna's work was more convincing. After receiving the samples, Noon thanked and invited Li JJ to sit somewhere. Chromium noted that the tension between them was not associated with long separation. Li Ju-won told about the tragic birthday of his sister, Sun, and how the apartment became empty without her with her parents. However, he vividly remembered the sympathetic and at the same time the evil look of Nuna. In the end, he could not stand and fled to the army after school. The Chromium wondered or defeated the offender, and Li Jo confirmed that he was caught, and most likely he was in Persephone. After the death of Sona, Nuno has not been engaged for some time, but it seemed like it found the purpose of existence. So, Li Jo was glad that she found herself, but Chromium apologized and showed the latest news. The Union broke out in the ranking through Viento and Babel's activities. Li Jan thought that they seek to take revenge on the guards, and that it was worth being a criminal again. In the end, he does not plan to harm civilians. He reassured the Chromium that his activity gave him to show up to talented heroes of the guard, but he was worried about where they were not. Meanwhile, in the bunker room, Zeus repaired Sanchi's mask. However, Pandora persuaded him to play with her. She decided to help accelerate and repair the mask by the magic. However, Zeus noted that they would fall when Pandora went and asked to turn everything back. When Banshee came after Pandora's mask, Zeus said that the tuning of the mask remained, but she agreed to wait. He asked how she broke the mask, and she justified that she did not control his strength. However, Zeus remarked about Arcadia and should not provoke it, but she answered what he knew, and her mistake helped after defeat to manifest the Union better. Then Zeus clarified whether she saw one of the criminals. Banshee told Viento she thought that he was overcome, but he turned out to be at large under the name of Balrog, but he seemed suspicious of Zeus. Sitting in the cabin of Li Ji, he drew sketches of the offender, and after a while, he was able to come up with the perfect image. It used to be larger and risk people's life. However, he could now attack the city quietly. With his goal, he defined money so destroyed valuable building. Although he promised Arcadia not to bend the stick, but he was very fond of revenge. Suddenly, a pod appeared. He remembered that she was on the battlefield last time he did not expect her pain. However, she skillfully threw a dart that opened a fiery flame and got directly into Li Ju. Subsequently, the pod attacked him with chewing gum. Li Ju-won did not understand how she improved her ability in such a short period, but the answer did not slow down. She became badly bad, but she still got ampule, thinking that the dose was not enough. Li Ju-won was alarmed because in his opinion, it destroyed justice. Therefore, he unexpectedly rushed to her to escape from the hands of the ampule. Suddenly, they were pushed by Zeus and said that the case was followed. He asked Vivi to leave because those who cannot fight should not stay on the battlefield. Zeus was also called the fighter of criminals, so Li Jaj was not lucky enough to come across him. He decided to stretch the time of fighting. Li Jaen tried to avoid Zeus, but he used Karen's lightning and kissed him. He tried to say that he wanted to talk to Zeus, but he did not want to talk to such garbage. Li Ji-won, realizing that he could not stand against Zeus, began to flee. But Zeus kissed him with a green beam and created smoke from the debris. However, when he came to the place to strike a fatal blow, near the body of the criminal, Zeus saw justice and asked if he destroyed him. While Zeus checked the body of Balrog Lee Jonah, he thought of how he was lucky to turn into smoke into justice before Zeus arrived. He noted that it was strange how easily managed to overcome the fleeing Ballo and released his body to the ground. Suddenly, he said that it was worth checking everything and asking Dorn to show scanned events. The device could clarify the situation and cover the truth. Li Jaen understood that he was at risk of exposing himself and trying to convince him that people needed to check. However, Zeus believed that it was necessary to deal with the drone. Then Li Ju decided that it was impossible to waste time and need to destroy the drone. However, instead of kissing the device, he dumped Zeus. He was frightened by the fact that he could have a fatal blow and thought whether he had to replace Zeus. At this time, Nati asked Volta or Zeus here, and when they saw his body on the ground, Li Ju, Vona was already running away from the crime scene. Going to the west, he was worried about what he did. At first, Chromium was hurt on him through her sister, and now even through Zeus. However, there was no other way out. When the Chromium asked what happened, he confessed that Zeus was killed. However, judging by his answers, she thought that Balrog was guilty of everything. The Chromium then asked whether she was free Ju-won on the weekend to take shopping. She believed that wearing clothes for a year is not good and needed to choose something new. Li Ju surprised that she was indifferent to Zeus. However, he later saw him going to the hall. As it turned out, he was eternal because of the memory chip. However, realizing that because of the backup of the memories of Zeus, he could know about the true incident of Li Jan, Vona did not. However, when Zeus came to him, he thanked him for the destruction of Balrog. As it turned out, a few minutes of Zeus's memory were still lost. The only thing he remembered how justice stands over the Balrog's body. However, Zeus was concerned that the strategy of Straight was not effective. Zeus is tired of playing the clans of the Union and the Superhuman. However, Li Ju-won noted the danger of criminals and suggested raising the topic at the meeting. Vivi walked past people remembering how Zeus depreciated her strength. However, she understood that the drug in the ampule helped her improve the potential. Suddenly, Vivi faced the hero and said he would relax. However, she realized that most looks bad and may also take the drug. At the gathering of the heroes of the naval, asked Zeus why everything looks like he wants to arrange a coup. Then he explained that many events happen. At first, the biolaboratorial was found to end with the appearance of the Ballo. The Superhumans and the Union did not perform duties. However, Nivel said that they work on these problems, and there is no need to change something. Pandora did not like his words, and she continued. Pandora told how the Balrog made it so that Zeus's head flew into piles. Everyone was surprised that Zeus lost the offender. Balrog was a stronger criminal, even though he escaped and evaded the attacks at the beginning of the battle. If it were not for justice, everything might have happened worse. However, when Arcadia learned that in addition to justice, no one had thought well, Li Ju-won noted that given the situation with Zeus, other clans may be affected and should be combated together despite the purpose of earning. Arcadia did not see the point of taking the labor force in the Union. However, the Triumph interrupted him, saying that he had significant problems and that he had to think. Meanwhile, a crowd of monsters in the mantle led by Michael went deep into the city. He clarified how the things were moving to Hidoro, to which he replied that all the trips were in position. So Michael activated collars on monsters and began a large-scale attack. They crashed everything they saw, and frighten people. Fortunately, Lee Jonah had time to help the woman, for which she thanked him. However, Michael was dissatisfied with the interference in his case. When asked whether the heroes always come to rescue so quickly, Lee Ji-won replied that all because a new treaty had come into force. While in the city, Chaos Yamnia fought with criminals and conducted a live broadcast in the blog. As soon as she wanted to talk about shelter on the outskirts of the city, a monster attacked her. She was able to react in time, but there were too many. Suddenly, Viento intervened in their battle and repelled the monster from the Yamni. She reminded that it was necessary to stop criminals, but he said that the Yamnia would fight herself. Before the Yamni, Justice approached her. She almost called him on the real name, but Lee Ju-won stopped her in time. He asked the Yamin to follow Viento, as his behavior seemed suspicious to him. Lee Ju-won asked Michael why he would not say that he did not suit him, but Michael reminded their battle in the laboratory. However, Lee Jonah asked him about his hand, because something was wrong with her, and suddenly broke from the place and separated her. When Michael tried to move away and tried to attack it, it did not work out and eventually fell to the ground. He did not understand how Lee Jan could quickly strike and got a fatal one. Lee Ju-won noticed as a remote control of the monsters. When the Yamni coped with the monster, she noted that the street was empty. She realized that she would not have enough in 10 bars but went on the street. One turned over the horn. She saw how heroes from the Union clan stand. Among them were Vivi. Yamnia wanted to approach, but Vivi struck her with fire. She managed to repel the attack and knocked the Vivi insulted on the ground on a spoiled face. However, she was advised by other heroes ready to attack. Then the Yamni realized that not only Vianto behaved surprisingly, the Yamni was convinced that she had overcome Vivi. However, she got up. 4 heroes attacked her in turn, and the Yamni realized that she would not cope. So she decided to absorb a few more bars and activated the grenade launcher Rabbit. It seemed that she may overdo it, but in a moment the monster appeared behind the Yamnia, from the impact of which the marathon flew away. He was pleased that the Yamni thanked the help and knew about him. In a moment, Volt and Nata came to find out what was happening. No one knew what was happening, however. Volt noticed a strange vessel on the neck of the invaded. He apologized and checked the neck of others, but there was no anomaly. It turns out that the problem concerned the clan of the Union, but it is not clear whether the same thing is happening. So, Volt increased the toy machine to place the bodies. When Volt and Nata went to take the pits that were enchanting, and the marathon did not know what to do, but suddenly the Yamni remembered Viento. Meanwhile, the Volt operated the truck on the road. Nata asked to leave him, but in a moment he turned the transport with his ability. Volt did not feel his feet, and Nata was injured. However, he tried to resist Viento while he attacked her. At this time, the marathon managed to grasp the Volt by the collar and pull it in a safe place as soon as possible. When they departed, the Yamnia sought to fight Viento. However, the marathon explained that Viento, the Lade, much stronger than those criminals they competed before. But suddenly she found several ampules in Viento's pocket, with the drug that was involved in justice. Now she knew what to do. The marathon took a Volt on the shoulders and asked the Yams not to be exhausted. In a moment, he ran away from the wounded and called for the help of the heroes. Yamnia realized that there were 2 bars left, so she decided to save them. However, the forces were uneven and it was greatly exhausted. Fortunately, the Yamnia had time to grab the drug Viento and drink it because there was no other choice. When she tried it, she felt nothing. Yamnia took the last beam, however, in a moment felt the tide of strength. Now she understood why there was a gap between her and Viento. She activated the gun of the Hypercrolic and immediately destroyed Viento with a powerful pink wave. However, despite the fact that she seemed to be a slight thing in the hospital, above it stood Chromium and Theo. Still, Toe asked why she used the drug knowing the consequences. However, she answered that there was no other way out. However, the problem was in crowded beds of the Union's heroes. In a moment, Nuna approached and noted that the Yamni helped prevent serious consequences. When she asked how the Yamnia feels, like she wanted to answer that well, however, the nausea came earlier and her stomach began to ache. Then Theo noted that she had to eat porrid. The Yamni was nosed by the news, however. The feasible was indomitable. When the Chromium and Theo left the house, he complained about the pits. However, when the Chromium asked why he panged with her, she reminded her of Li Ju. The Chromium asked why the heroes were not transported to Atrium. So, Theo replied that Nuno was working with drugs. At the same time, the Chromium mentioned the strange sign on her documents. In the Persephone isolator, the guards dealt with criminals. When Hest asked if enough workers, one of the guards denied it. The cameras were not enough, and most of the heroes of the Union were neutralized. Other heroes were safety in the city. That was quite difficult. At this time, the exhausted Michael was led to the camera. When he chose a place, another prisoner said that he belonged to him and threatened to separate his hand. However, Unexpectedly, Michael destroyed the restraint and destroyed the prisoner with his ability. He took his hand and told him that he would need it. Meanwhile, Lee Jan explained the chromium that it is better to take Michael's destruction because the personal duties and the tasks of justice would be difficult to combine. Lee Joni said that the capture of the exhausted Michael was uninteresting. In addition, it was still unknown about his motives. Suddenly, the chromium asked how she was in Lee Ju, but he explained that when everything subsided after the heroes' gathering, time may appear. So the chromium specified whether it was free and received a list with planned affairs. Lee Ju Wan noted that the chromium was very prudent, and she explained that it was the key to success. However, suddenly she called Stiletto and had to interrupt. While she talked, she was reading a list of business and did not understand why it was so detailed because it was already reminiscent of a date. Suddenly, chromium rose sharply and pulled Lee Ju. They had to come to the hospital immediately where the Yamni was lying. On the phone, Stiletto reported that he found out where the strange symbol of Nuna was. On the tanks of water in the laboratory, Michael he saw an identical sign. At the hospital Ju-X11, she visited the Yamni and asked her well, being that she answered that she was full of strength and energy. Nuna rejoiced in such a well-being. Yamnia wanted to stir, however, the desire to drink outstanding. She was bored, and she didn't know how much she would have to be in the hospital. Suddenly, a monster will pour out of the window. After a while, the heroes of the Union also began to behave aggressively, although the Yamnia thought that they got better. However, she was even more amazed by the fact that there was a beam in her pocket, although they were not issued in the hospital. So, when she was captured by the monster. Meanwhile, the confused Lee Jan went to the hospital. He did not believe that Nuna was involved in drugs and the death of Justice. When he met her, he asked whether these absurd news, however, was silent. He broke into the cry demanding explanation. However, in a moment, the windows of the upper floors of the hospital were crushed, and there was a cry from there. But Nuna said that the medicine was not eventually acting, and the madness should be fixed. He still passed by the shot, but stopped him. As it turned out, Nuno created a new copy of Kim-san from the cells of justice, and advised not to compete with him. She also noted that the chromium was not to help. However, Lee Jian said that she did not know what was a hidden hero. At this time, the Yamini was beaten in the hallway, but suddenly it stopped feeling pain. Wilhelm kept her in her hands and noted her beauty. The Yamini asked whether he took the drug, but Wilhelm explained that he had fainted due to alcohol and suggested that the next time dinner. Suddenly, a monster attacked Wilhelm. However, he was attentive and rejected him and remembered the words of the teacher that younger colleagues needed to learn etiquette. Wilhelm was said to be a key figure when suppressing criminals, so if it was true, he could be a strong hero. However, he was suddenly taken across and he could not fight. But despite this, he evaded the blows and thus destroyed the enlarged heroes. Wilhelm said that he had to do warm up before the battle. However, the Yamni noted that despite this, due to his ingenuity, they were still not injured. When they encumbered, Wilhelm fell directly on them. Then he got up and aimed to teach the etiquette of others, skillfully destroyed them in turn. Meanwhile, Nuna did not understand where Li Ju's strength came from, if he only copies the appearance. Then he attacked Kim-sun and said that it was a long story. Despite understanding whom Kim-sun was for him, Li Jian was angry at him. However, he got up and struck fire. Li Ju-won thought that he destroyed Kim-sun, but every time he came to life, and his forces were in vain. However, the idea of the cyclicality of the process sounded it. Nuna had no point in competing with Kim-sun, but suddenly he could not activate power, and then Li Jo-won directed a volcanic magnum on him. There were too many criminals in the Persephone detention center. The guards drove out of this heroes and decided that a couple of lost would not make the weather. Suddenly, one of the criminals came to Michael, so he said that the offender had what he needed, and destroyed him by taking his device with him. Michael's activities were noticed by the guards and ordered to raise their hands up to the floor. However, Michael thanked that they brought criminals up. Li Jian was able to overcome Kim-sun. However, Li Ju could not afford to lose. Therefore, using the magic, she revived Kim-sun. Li Jonavona managed to win again, but she continued to revive Kim-sun. But her forces were not so Nuna almost lost consciousness. While Li Ji-wan held her hand to him, the Yamni and Wilhelm had already walked to him. The Yamni almost called him Justice, but he again prevented it from happening. Li Ju-wan asked the state of the heroes in the ward, however. Wilhelm replied that they were all suppressed. Li Ju-wan acknowledged that Wilhelm was not as weak as it seemed, but he cried when the involvement of Nuna understood everything. He remembered that he met the same spicy woman, but then she blocked him. Having done what to do next, Li Jian said that you need to contact the atrium and then imprison the characters. But suddenly they heard a terrible explosion. The Persephone insulator caught fire, so Lia Wan turned to Nuna with reproaches for making it. The second security group was severely injured. The guard has already reached the weapon, however, the first tool was seized. When he asked how she released, the flurry explained that Michael's explosion released all her friends and brought him a fatal wound to his weapon. Two criminals in the detention hall were mocked the guard as well as over them. When they heard someone singing, they invited to have fun. However, when they saw that this flurry was immediately frightened, she turned her hand into a jaw and neutralized one of the criminals. The flurry was addressed by his partner, with questions where the room of the criminals was located, and he pointed to one of the door. In fact, Michael asked a flurry to bring some things. However, she did not know some things, and she did not know where he plans to use them. Meanwhile, battles were underway near the energy object. The criminals watched the wall for the wall, but one of them came out to crush the guards. He was not taken by the balls, and he almost destroyed the young guard, however, but a hot man appeared and pushed the criminal on pieces. She asked the situation from the young guard, and he replied that almost all the criminals were released, and only she was released from the heroes. But he still praised him for his job. At this time, the narrow-eyed criminal was afraid to get out, but Tan stated that she could be overcome. A crowd of criminals ran to attack the Heat. However, with her sword she quickly overcame most of the attackers. The Hot ran for one of the criminals in the corridor and asked to surrender for a pardon. However, he replied that he did not just come here. In a moment, a bunch of criminals surrounded her. She competed in every possible way but did not have time to follow one of them, and he managed to immobilize the Hot. Still, she was lucky because Red, with her crown monologue about a burning passion, came to the rescue. Michael arrived in the area of special supervision, opening the door in front of him, a nemesis in his shackles, and Michael said that he had come to release him. While the Hot was surprised by the arrival of Red Chrome, she released her and twisted other criminals with shadows. She was surprised that Red wanted to fight alone. Heast asked why they arrived earlier, and Chrome told how she spoke to Lee JJ. She was a symbol from Michael's laboratory on the clipboard. However, Lee Jonu refused to move his chromium with him and ordered her to go to Persephone's because the situation was quite suspicious there. In the other part of the detention center, Stiletto competed with the criminals with the help of Bones. Marksy was attacked by a laser, thus, all those heroes who succeeded. Red asked the Hot not to worry, and called her a burning sun, but she did not like it when she was called so. Red, however, refused to tell her what was called the honorary heroes, and she should be proud of this title, although the Hot deny it. The Chromium surprised how these two managed to fight and have a dispute in parallel, so she decided to go to help others in the battle. However, suddenly Nemesis came to the battlefield and proclaimed that he was sad for them. He could not escape so easily, so Chromium suggested that someone had released him, but she did not like the atmosphere, because the Chromium was 6th in the overall rating of heroes, and Red could easily destroy Nemesis as justice. However, she saw the bodies of Theo and Marksy and wanted to rush to save them, but Red stopped it, his hands shaky crazy. All the heroes were nervous, but Red tried to hold on and ordered the captain immediately. The Chromium did not understand what was happening when Red asked to call him Burning Red, and Hest added that he added better to listen to him. The Chromium dreamed away, and Nemesis did not stop it. Judging by the emotionality of Chromium, he guessed that no one told her the truth about the first battle. After a while, the sword and the left side of the Heast were bloody and red, with a broken helmet kept Nemesis by his neck. He was bored with heroes. However, Heast was incendiary and stubborn, so Nemesis suggested that her join him. However, the Red did not like it, and hit him with a helmet. At that time, Nemesis remembered that Red had the ability to heal injuries, so he would agree for a pair for beating, and Nemesis began to cripple the cervical vertebrae. The Hot did not endure the bullying, however. She had no strength. She leaned on the bloody sword. However, she could not reach Nemesis. At the last moment, she saw Lee Jonah study and threw it into the wall, thus freeing Red from the trap. Lee Ju-won analyzed the situation and rushed to Hast. He noted that she lost a lot of blood, so he asked for a scar and a breeze of a wound with flames. Soon, Nemesis was astonished and rejoiced in seeing justice. He asked whether he met him, but Lee Ji said that he would try not to be disappointed. The Triumph viewed the paintings in the office as suddenly an assistant came to him. He reported that there was an explosion in Persephone, and most criminals were free. The Triumph was disappointed with the protection of the place and learned that justice was sent to the place. Previously, he easily suppressed special criminals, however, not alone. Nemesis mentioned that their battle resembles old good time. However, after a while, Lee Jan realized that Nemesis was regenerating very quickly. He decided to activate the awakening of the original Magnum. He asked why the Gentiles boast of force when they did not really represent anything. However, suddenly he stood up and said that he had not fought for a long time and now needed. It was necessary to change the tactics, and Lee Ju decided to apply the power of Kim San. Nemesis surrounded Lee Ju and asked why he opened if he knew that his loss would be crucial. Meanwhile, the forces of Lee Ju combed. In a moment, Nemesis stirred on a magical fire, and stunned at Lee Ju's attack, she became hotter than usual. Suddenly, Michael entered the battlefield and said that everything was ready. Then Nemesis turned to Lee JJ that she never fight with him, and that there are more important dishes. In a moment, thanks to Michael, the walls began to collapse and Nemesis advised to leave it and take care of the hot with red. Michael asked why Nemesis did so, and whether he was fine, but did not answer. Nemesis was interested in whether it was justice. While the hot and red lay on the ground, Lee Ji tried to hit the walls and received wounds on the bones. His abilities did not work. Nemesis felt the fresh air again, but he was more interested in why the operation of his liberation lasted for so long. Michael asked, and explained that it was necessary to come up with a plan and get rid of spies, and also to lure one woman on their side. Nemesis was answered, and climbed to the highest mountain of debris to get ovations from criminals. Meanwhile, the Chromium listened to them standing behind a wreckage. She regretted that she had not guessed their plans earlier, and moved her shadow to Lee Ju. She saw the wounded hot and red. Chromium spoke to Lee Ju that she should be attributed to immediately, but did not understand what was happening to him. The news announced that in the morning in Persephone, there was an explosion and most criminals escaped. Therefore, the heroes needed to at least understand the situation. Meanwhile, the hot was recovered in the hospital and wondered the condition of the feasibility study. Doctors in the operating room did not know or save it due to damaged nerve ending. However, the Chromium was interested in what Nemesis said and what the characters hid. So, without making sense to keep the secret of the hot, it was ready to tell the truth. Lee Ju-won was in the training room. Previously, he could deal with 10 obstacles, but his abilities were severely weakened. The problem was not in the mood. The forces of justice could be restored. However, Kim Sony disappeared without a trace. Nemesis was somehow put on it. Suddenly, he came to his triumph, and he noted and really weakened. Lee Ju-won decided that the triumph was abandoned, so he asked him to leave. However, the triumph attacked him sharply. Lee Ju-won prepared to defend himself from the attack, but instead the triumph asked how long he would continue the performance. Heisei was resting the events of the first battle with Nemesis. Justice really threw him into the wall, but then his strength was weakened, and Nemesis was not destroyed. Then a triumph came to the aid, and warned Nemesis that their total abilities would erase it to gunpowder. When the hot came to the place, Nemesis was already destroyed. Then Justice ordered her to move the Nemesis to the Persephone. The Chromium asked why it was to lie, so she answered that Nemesis was in prison. But despite the defeat of the leader, the criminals would not stop. Therefore, the Triumph suggested that Justice is the strongest hero. His initiative was struck by Chromium. Suddenly, the TV industry and the radio was captured by Nemesis. He stated that he did not do anything evil, only his lodging was a little bit. Nemesis appealed to the TV presenters that their profession was to broadcast the truth at the cost of life. So, he stated on the camera that Justice was weaker than him. As evidence, Nemesis declared the battle the next day at noon. If Justice loses or does not come, then all die, but if he returns to prison. Meanwhile, Triumph asked what Lee Ji would do now after he attacked Nemesis, knowing that his abilities were to burn someone else's power. Suddenly, the Chromium arrived at the place, bypassing the news about the duel and his details. So, the Triumph decided to go to understand myself. In his opinion, the lull of criminals was to have the strongest hero, so this image had to be preserved, and asked not to interfere with him. The Triumph did not know that Nemesis took only Kim San's ability, so, according to Lee Ju, if the Triumph went to fight itself, then the risk of losing all the strength. She asked Chromium at Lee JJ that with his face, and he explained that he did not like it all, and that 2 billion won should work. Chromium said that he was at risk of injuring, however, Lee Ju-won has already invented a plan as a Nemesis could be overcome. When the Trim said during the meeting, there was one delicate question of Zeus, that he had to finally attack criminals and destroy a small building. However, the Hot stated that they could not risk prisoners. In addition, it is not known what to do with criminals inside. Nivelle added that the massive blow to the office of the TV channel will splash the title of heroes and spread this opinion in the world. However, Zeus was waiting for another plan. He was also annoyed that Justice did not respond, but the Hot explained that he was recovering. She did not know how to persuade Zeus to reject the attack on the office. Then the Triumph stated that he was going, but did not plan to fight Nemesis. His mission will find out the situation within the office before making a decision. When he stepped into the elevator, he joined him. She noted that the invited Justice was, and that it could be a trap to Triumph. Then he asked how the Hot treats people, and noticed that they were in vain to solve the question where the heroes exceed them. When the Hot Trumpet added that the characters should save people at the cost of life, however, Justice did not consider it, so he went to wish him a recovery. Zeus followed the hot as suddenly Pandora climbed on him. She tried to convince him that now is the time to destroy all the criminals in prison. But Zeus denied and said that if the Trium refuses to cooperate, he would make it. While the criminals at the entrance to the office thought that Justice would not come to the place of Trum on Black Mercedes, the Trim answered the Trim that he had arrived from the face of all the heroes. However, one of the criminals was terrified that he was wrong. Nemesis desires only justice, and not someone like a Trum, however. His assistant quickly neutralized criminals. But at the same time, the hero in the white mantle reported the installed explosive in the room. Another character asked if it was sense to risk people's lives. However, Zeus said that he would take responsibility and that it would save more lives. When the Trium went to television studio through a living corridor from a crowd of criminals, he was already waiting for Nemesis with the question of why he sees him in front of him. The Trium ignored the question and said that it should not be done carelessly because by destroying prisoners, Nemesis would start a total war. However, Nemesis asked if he really believed that he would stop there and what would happen if he finished the Trium. In a moment, Nemesis attacked him. Trium asked if he seriously said it, but Nemesis asked not to pretend to be stupid, because he thought it was obvious that he would not leave the hero whole. After a few attempts to attack the Trium, Nemesis asked why he would not apply the well-known power of magic. Looking at everything from the drone, Zeus summed up that negotiations with criminals did not end with anything good, and ordered the heroine in the white mantle to blow up the office. However, when she handed over the blast, someone grabbed him and stole it with another assistant, and for a moment her back, a Trium, was set. He noted that the heroes of the Condor clan were poorly prepared, and began to attack the hero with peach hair twisted into the tail. She noted that if the Trium suddenly attacks here, it is unknown who competes with the Nemesis on the floor above. The hero evaded the strokes of the Nemesis, however. When he relaxed, the hero used a powerful blow to the blue beam that threw him into the wall. Nemesis understood that it was not the power of the Trum, and then Lee Ji-won in the form of Justice stated that he had come on time and waited for the moment to attack. An hour ago, the Trium sat in Mercedes, and where he was waiting for Lee Ji-won, he said that he wanted to support and advise the victory plan, and the Trium did not expel him. When Nemesis rose from the place and was ready to attack, Lee Ji-won took the armature as weapons. He did not want to let Nemesis too close. He admitted a couple of misses, however. He eventually kissed a handful of heavy metal spears into the body of Nemesis, but it did not stop him. Nemesis got rid of wounds with magic and kissed Lee Joni in his face. However, he was able to escape and bypass the next blow. He understood that the battle would be difficult, so that he got the drug from the bag to enhance the ability. Before that, he warned the Chromium that it would take advantage of this in battle. She recalled what the consequences of the patients had. However, Lee Ju joked that no one had died and could not allow people to suffer. Lee Ju-won drank the contents of the ampule, but suddenly the floor shuddered and the explosion occurred. He thought it was Zeus's hands. However, having seen the fragments of glass covered with green liquid, his last chance was destroyed, and Nemesis asked behind him whether it was his whole plan. The Trium took the peel with peach hair and began to shout angrily that they had done. She denied, saying that it could have overcome Nemesis. But the Trium was denied because Nemesis did not destroy people, and Condor's heroes were worse than criminals. He suggested fleeing to a safe place, however, the heroic refused. So the Trium ordered Zeus to call not to remain under the rubble. Nemesis realized that the supports were destroyed, so it should be a case of Condor's hands. However, the disappointed Lee JJ laughed him to tears. It was ridiculous to understand that the hero wanted to overcome him with the help of drugs and struck Lee Ju-won. It took away the remains of his strength. When Nemesis poured anger, hitting Lee Ju's face, she released him, confessing that he could not hear Justice praised by his abilities. He did not know how to take revenge on him, but in the end, Nemesis decided to shoot on video as Justice escaped as the last coward from the battle. But Lee Jae-an mentioned how he was naked when his sister was destroyed. He noted that a lot of fallen and his strength did not remain around, and suddenly he was illuminated. When Nemesis suited that Justice did not overcome him, Lee Ji, he confirmed it and argued that his strength was much less. However, it would be so if he were really Justice. At this point, Lee Jin touched the offender and filled with force to continue the battle. Nemesis did not understand what was happening and began to attack Lee Ju, but he applied protection and reflected well against the attack. When Nemesis tried to hit Lee Ju again, She was opened on a pebble and reflected from the body. Then he took the nemesis by his face. However, he was able to grab Li Jui by grabbing her leg and shaking it to the wreckage of the building. However, Li Jian was able to absorb the abilities of other criminals and become stronger. Nemesis noted that he immediately understood something suspicious. He was neither a triome nor justice, and his strength was in the transformation and duplication of abilities. So, it was interesting for Nemesis to compete with Li Jian. Suddenly, a man who pleaded for salvation came to him. However, Nemesis turned him into ashes with other bodies, so that Li Jia's did not gain strength. At this time, Li Jian realized that the abilities of the previous offender were not accurate, and had to go on an offensive. Nemesis was happy about this occasion, because he wanted to absorb his strength. However, instead, Li Ju separately separated his hand, and noted that he was not good. However, Nemesis said that he could restore her hand and grabbed Li Jizhai by her throat. Each of the chosen variants of action guaranteed the death of Li Ju. Nemesis did not expect that Li Jian would be able to absorb his abilities through a separated hand, just as in the case of a flurry. Therefore, leaving Nemesis without the forces of Li Jian, he proclaimed that under the article of the law on the relations of criminals with the heroes of punishment was brought to execution. While the excavator was preparing for the destruction of the building where the battle of justice was held, and the Nemesis reporter reported in the news. When the building could fall on hundreds of captive Zeus, along with Pandora helped keep the first floors on their own. Pandora was worried that the roar was still heard from above, but Zeus reassured her that it was empty. Meanwhile, people hid that they would not be harvested, but fortunately, Arcadia managed to keep them. He extended the official business card of the Union clan, and told the people that the heroes of the Union here to save them. Li Ju-won listened to the news and was satisfied. He thought whether it was worth punishing Zeus, however, if it were not for him to be heaven. He asked where Chromium learned how to make hairstyles professionally. She told how she asked the Yamni to help her, so since then Chromium worked as a para-camel. Having spoken to the reincarnation for the sake of changing the hairstyle, Chrome added that Li Ju-won may refuse the title of justice as Nemesis was destroyed. However, Li Ju-ju refused to work 2 million won and did not want to return to freelance. In addition, he could break the truth. Chrome wanted to warn the Hot about it, as suddenly Li John came back to ask for a vacation for their date and called him unceremonious. When Li Jian came out to the journalists, he was waiting for the standing. One of them asked what the words of Nemesis meant about the weakness of justice. Li Ju-won replied that it was a provocation, because in reality Nemesis was defeated in the war, and his forces were in vain because of the invincibility of justice. Meanwhile, a flurry was attacked in the area of red on the man. She went to the table of the establishment by bypassing Michael's list. One of the criminals expressed concern about the impunity of their action. However, a girl with turquoise hair said that the death of Nemesis would not affect it. In the end, their goal was to take a T-shirt. The offender with a cigarette believed that Nemesis was specifically imprisoned, but let the criminals there all was wonderful.